Hi everyone, welcome to the Car Chat podcast. I'm Sam Moores, and with us this week we have Tom Callow. Hello.
Hi Sam, pleasure to be here.
Hello. Can you tell the audience and listeners a little bit about sort of who you are and what you do?
Sure. So, as you say, my name is Tom Callow. I'm currently the head of corporate communications for a company called MyEnergy. We're a British eco-smart, we call it eco-smart home technology company. So we make energy smart products for the home, including an EV charger, which we'll talk about in a minute. But my background is really in automotive, so hence the car podcast. I spent a long time working in automotive public relations agency. I've worked for a big automotive services business called Cox Automotive, and I've worked, I guess, for the last 10 years off and on in the electric vehicle sector, electric vehicle charging. So that's become a bit of a mastermind specialist subject, I guess.
Yeah, I think I probably came across you on Twitter for the first time, I don't know, ages ago, on chiming in on various automotive topics over the time.
And I have a twin brother, which often is the reason people name me.
and you have a brother, yes, who I've also come across. So I guess one of the things, let's roll back a bit. How did you get into all this? You've obviously been into cars for a while, but you've sort of diverged. Talk me through it.
So I guess from a very young age, I was always interested in cars. I've never called myself a petrolhead, and it's not because I don't like petrol powered cars or anything like that. But I always had more of a fascination with cars as a kind of a product and the motor industry as a whole, I guess. And there's a famous story that my mum will tell about my brother and I being in a buggy when we were being pushed up to collect my older sister from school, and bearing in mind we were still at the age to be in a buggy, one of us, I'll claim it was me, but one of us pointed out, I think, that like the hubcaps on I don't know, whatever at the time, a Ford Fiesta were Vauxhall hubcaps, and we asked our mum why there were Vauxhall hubcaps on a Ford, and she just didn't know, obviously. Anyway, so there's sort of always been a car interest. I don't know why from a young age, and I think she sort of said that she used to read the make and model of the cars on the way up to the school as like a thing to do to pass the time. I guess it was probably at school when the reason I'm in this sector, I think, is probably that, as I say, I was always passionate about cars and driving, bluntly. And I was one of these people that learned to drive pretty much as quickly as I could. And I sort of learned in a Range Rover in a field when I was 14, actually, but not my Range Rover, not my field, I should say.
Start.
not very legal though. But I just I don't know what it was actually that made me realise this. But when I was at secondary school, I came to the conclusion that this thing that I loved was a problem for the environment. Basically, we couldn't sustain it in the current way, and that, maybe it was studying geography or whatever, but it kind of made me a bit sad, bluntly. And I thought, well, I don't want to not drive. I don't want to not have cars around when I'm older. So is there a way we get to a place where we can still have cars, but actually they're not this sort of terrible burden on the climate? So that really drove my interest in alternative fuels, I guess, and doing things in a different way. So I think I wrote a dissertation when I was, 4,000 word dissertation, not very long one, when I was 17, about the storage of hydrogen in passenger cars and whether that was going to be an option. And I just got fascinated in the topic, really. So I've always loved writing, always loved cars. And I think at a young age wanted to be a motoring journalist. Told my teachers that, to which they bristled and said, "Don't be stupid. Go and do something academic. Don't do vocation. Don't go off to university and study journalism. Go off and study some sort of academic degree." So I did, sort of slightly begrudgingly. And when I finished university, I went to work for an automotive public relations agency. So I wasn't a million miles away. And having wanted to be a motoring journalist, I basically met some of the, let's say, older school motoring journalists, and decided that I didn't want to be a motoring journalist, having met them. I think there's an old guard that are very different from the kind of amazing new crop, not new now, but younger crop of people who love their job and people who see themselves having the best job ever. I think there was, unfortunately, a generation where there was a huge sense of entitlement, and having met those people, I just thought, crikey, I really don't want to turn into someone that gets sort of snobby when they don't turn left when they walk on an airplane, that sort of thing. And I met some great people in public relations and thought, well, this is a more positive kind of, less cynical kind of career option maybe. And spent 7 years in a public relations agency working with pretty much every automotive company you can imagine, sort of lots on the kind of widget maker side, lots on the tech side, tier ones, but also some car manufacturers as well. So it just allowed me to explore that fascination with the motor industry, really, from, wiper blades and spark plugs to, helping to do sort of first test drives and some sort of fairly innovative electric cars.
Yeah.
I think one of my first jobs was the launch of a converted 911, actually, that was made by Roos, sorry. So a Lois came over and we actually launched it at the SMMT. I say we launched it. We did a test drive with about 20 journalists at the SMMT, which was at Forbes House over in Halkin Street in London at that time.
Yeah.
And I lay claim to ruining the front lawn about a week before someone was meant to be having a wedding there, because we basically put this really heavy duty matting down on the front lawn at Forbes House and had this 2-ton electric 911 squashing.
They did an electric 911.
They did an electric 911 conversion. Yeah. It was a one-off. It was called the E-Roof or the E-Roof. Okay. It was a black thing, really lovely, but heavy, so I ruined the front lawn at Forbes House. And also I think at one point was Ken Gibson came along and he drove it, and they thought they were going to have another person, I think, on the shoot. And I ended up having to drive his long-termer Civic Type R around Belgravia with the boot open, with a photographer whose name I'm afraid I can't remember, hanging out of the boot, shooting pictures of Ken Gibson driving around Belgravia, around all the embassies where all these armed guards were sort of like eyeing me up, like, what are you doing? And I thought, well, I think you're more bothered about defending the embassy than like figuring out whether I'm breaking any laws by doing this.
They're not allowed. No, they might be. I don't think they're really allowed to move.
No, I don't think they are. So I think even if I was doing something wrong, I think they just had to stand there and be sort of begrudgingly annoyed about it.
Yeah,
but that was one of my earliest memories of PR. Basically, was I feel like I'd made the right move by driving a Civic Type R around Belgravia with the boot open and a photographer hanging out.
Yeah, it's interesting. Something you said early on is you don't like to be branded a petrolhead. I did some work with someone recently, and they were like, they wanted me to talk about their car and do some stuff and whatever. And they were like, you're a petrolhead. And I was like, And this was a hybrid we were looking at. And they were like, we want to talk to you about hybrids and stuff. And I was like, well, I don't know whether I am a petrolhead. Like, I don't think that's the right word anymore. Like, I think like car enthusiast is probably better for a lot of people now. Almost being a petrolhead says to me that you're this person that's sort of religiously stuck in the petrol only is the only solution. Nothing else is possible. And I'm sure you must butt up against quite a lot of people on a daily basis who are in that kind of camp of just rage. It feels like there's just rage that like petrol cars are going to be, EVs must be the devil. Any other solution must be horrific. And like, it's difficult to sort of take on new information. It's a funny one.
Yeah, it's a global change management process. And it's what you always come up against in any change management, where there are always people that don't like change, and that's fine in that's a natural human reaction to have. So I don't begrudge them for that, but it is about kind of making sure you can kind of, to use the horrible analogy, kind of take them on that journey. One of the best lessons, I know it's a really simple thing, one of the best lessons one of my old bosses said was, change is constant. In any role, in any job, in life generally, you should always expect change, because change is constant. And if you assume that nothing will ever change, that's when the nasty surprises will happen, because you'll get blindsided by it. So I've always lived, I guess more recently with that mentality that stuff will always change, stuff will always move around. And actually, as long as you understand that and it doesn't freak you out, I think that's sort of generally a good way to go about living. But yeah, I guess it's a weird term, isn't it? Because nobody, there might be some petrochemists, I don't know, in oil and gas companies that really love petrol, but no one I've met who's a car enthusiast loves petroleum per se. Yeah. I know a few people that think it smells nice. I'm sure I was in one of those. I'm sure I had that weird thing when I was a kid. I thought, petrol's this weirdly nice smell. But no one really loves petrol, and no one really loves the oily stuff you shove in the tank. It's more what that derives, right? It's the experience that you get from a vehicle using that substance in a combustion process, and actually, the more you scratch the surface and you get down to the nub of it, you say to people, what is it that you actually kind of will miss? What is it that you can't let go of? And a lot of the time people go, the noise. I can't live without the noise. And then you go, but modern internal combustion engine cars are very quiet anyway, right? I mean, one of my biggest disappointments is like, if you go to somewhere like Goodwood, you go to Festival of Speed, the best noisiest runs are not the modern supercar run, right? The best noisiest runs are all the old stuff when the like Beast of Turin goes up the hill or whatever. When all the modern supercars go up, they all kind of sound whooshy, same kind of, downsized internal combustion. It's all a bit, so what? And, it's the same and it's for very good reasons, obviously, that they've all been engineered to into their life to be quite quiet. So they don't really make much noise anyway, unless you absolutely spank them. And if you do the same in electric vehicles, they also make a noise. It's different noise, but it's you can, I think you can probably sort of learn to like it, if not love it. But it's the noise is a big thing. I think people also like the manual kind of intervention of a lot of internal combustion engines. But again, with slippage towards kind of automated gearboxes and DSGs or whatever, people again have kind of changed their mindsets around, do I need a stick? Do I need stick shift? Like, do I need a manual transmission, or and more and more, I see more and more journalists over the years kind of accept that actually, do you know what? It's faster. It's better. It's fine. I can live without it. And I think it's just that, again, it's just change management. It's people having lived with something for best part of a century, suddenly going, oh, maybe I don't need it to be the same as it always was. There are people who have this weird pathological hatred of electric vehicles, but most people are not that way inclined. Most people I meet are skeptical, which is fine. No problem with skepticism. They are anxious, again, fine. No problem with anxiety, because it is a change and you need to be educated about it and you need to have knowledge about it. But as I say, it's a tiny minority who have this weird, vociferous kind of like hatred, if you like, which is very strange. And to be honest, that very, very small minority are, like, I almost liken them to kind of the NRA in the US. It's that level of kind of clinging to your gun type thing, where there's no rationality to it whatsoever. You're not about to be the government is not about to rise up and like come out against you all with guns. There's not going to be a government uprising. You're not about to get invaded by aliens. You don't need an automatic rifle in your shed. Like, you just don't need it. And it's that level of kind of willful kind of ignorance that I think is there in some small circles, but it is the vast minority.
Yeah, it is. It is an interesting one. I think being in the sort of automotive kind of journalisty, whatever sort of space-ish, you come across those people like vocally quite a lot. And I think one thing I found, so I got an E208 on a lease, which actually goes back on Friday, 2 years ago. And it was, I think a bit like you, over the last, 5 years, 10 years, I've started thinking more about the environment and the future. And I've now got a kid and that sort of stuff. And like, I love cars. I love driving. I love design. I love a V12. I love an awesome experience. But then in the back of my mind, I do have this like, okay, air quality. Air quality is a huge one for me at the moment. I live in London and the air quality is not good. And it's all right where I am, but it's really bad in other areas. And that I look at and go, right, what is the solution? And the solution for that, the only solution for that really is electric vehicles. People would talk about using synthetic fuels and whatever, but it's still basically kind of like a petrol substance that kicks out a lot of rubbish when you burn it.
Yep.
So that sort of, I thought, okay, maybe I shouldn't be driving a V12 around town. Maybe I should have an EV for sort of shorter journeys, and then long journeys. I'm not going to put myself out there in the sense of testing infrastructure and really go to that crazy level of planning and whatnot. to drive all my long distances in an EV. So I got an E208, and it was a really interesting experience. I don't know. Do you remember the first like couple of weeks of your EV journey?
I think, so I guess the first time I drove an electric car was probably in something like 2009. I don't know. So I guess I had experience of them, but not living with them. And I think the first time I properly lived with one for like a week or more was probably in about 2013, 14. So weirdly, we were doing a bit of PR for BYD. I mean, BYD 10 years ago was totally unrecognizable in terms of the vehicle type, right? From where you are now. I mean, it was a car called the E6, if you want to look that up. And I sort of weirdly, although I was in a public relations role, we'd kind of ended up assisting on kind of brokering a deal between what was then, BYD basically, and a company called Green Tomato Cars at the time. This is all in public domain. I'm not revealing any secrets. And we did, I won't say who, we did approach a different private hire company, and the founder basically said climate change isn't real. So that was a short conversation. But the Green Tomato, very open-minded company, they really, really sort of love the concept of going electric. Still in contact with a couple of the founders from there today, sort of in terms of the team that were behind it. And initially we sort of managed to get a deal where they brought, I think, 50 over, but it just didn't work because the infrastructure at the end of the day for them. So it kind of fell apart, and the cars ended up in Uber fleets and stuff. But I had this car for about a week. And I demonstrated it around, took it to my old secondary school, did a chat with some students there, took it to my mum's primary school, got primary school kids excited about electric cars, drove it up and down, around the UK a little bit. Did a lap of the M25. So we did an all up. I know Top Gear just did the 24 hours of the M25. I did a full circumnavigation of the M25 from Park Royal over in West London. So we drove out from Park Royal all around the M25 and back to the sort of depot on Park Royal, which I think worked out to about 144 miles in total.
What was the range on that car?
Well, officially, I think it was 186. I'm being a real nerd now. I think it was about 186.
Like on the edge.
I've always been a bit of a maverick with electric cars, and I have run out of range twice as well. But I like running them down because I kind of want to see what they can do. So I'm not one of these people that goes below 20% and then freaks out and goes for a charging point. I like to run them down sort of like 0 or 1% if I can. But I got back to Park Royal with 1 mile of range remaining, and I had we were 4 up actually, not 5. So three Chinese guys from BYD in the car with me who it was a hot summer day, but they were sweating. They were like, they were really panicking that we were going to run this car out in the middle of the A40 or whatever. But we made it, and it was 24 degrees summer day. The aircon was on full, as I say, all around the M25. And when I wasn't going at 50 miles an hour, we were doing 70 mile an hour speeds pretty much all the way around, right? We were going as fast as we could, within legal limits to show the car could do it. But that wasn't bad because that was a 63 kilowatt hour battery. And as I say, the range on it was 186 miles, something like that, as an official cycle, and we got about 145 out of it. So compared to today's EVs, that's crap. My e-Niro has the same size battery, which I used to have, and that could do double that range, 280 miles, no problem. So range has definitely improved. But the E6 was fascinating to live with it. And the memory I have, apart from the interesting N25 drive, was the biggest memory I have from that week with it was I had to plan journeys around where I was going to charge the car, right? That was the key thing. So firstly, it didn't have a home charge. I didn't have a 3-pin plug with it because it was a Chinese imported vehicle. I had no 3-pin charger for it. I could have probably bought one actually at the time, but I didn't think about doing that. So I had no way of charging it at my house. So I had to rely on public charging. And every time I was thinking about going somewhere, I had to think, hang on, I need to go somewhere first to charge it. Then I need to go to the place, and how am I going to do all of that? Whereas now I just don't do any of that. I don't have to think, hang on, I've got to drive. And we're talking about, I was living with my parents at the time down in Kent, and so I had to drive from northwest Kent down the A2 basically to, I think, Maidstone or something, to the services, charge there, turn around and come back up the A2. It was just crazy. Yeah. It was a daft way to have to live. But thankfully we're some way beyond that now, I guess.
Things have moved on. Okay, one of the things that you just mentioned, which I still never want to do, is running to zero. Like, when have you done it? And what did you do?
So the most important thing I'll say about this is that the reason someone's going to say, I ran out of range because the charging station didn't work, but there's enough chargers out there now that the reason you run out of range, if you run out of range today, as I've done twice, it's the same reason people run out of petrol or diesel. Is that basically they're reckless. Yeah. Reckless. There's no logical reason why you should ever run out of fuel, and really there's no logical reason why you should ever run out of electric range in your EV, given the number of charge points that are around. So it's a level of recklessness. It's a level of driving past charging stations that you could have stopped at because you think you can make it, or you're not paying attention to the range readout, whatever. That's the reason. So the first time was a Nissan Leaf. I was driving back from Luton, where I worked at the time, driving back to Surrey, and I basically had just about enough in the battery. And I drove past, 25 rapid chargers on the way, various points, and I was like, I can make it. And it got to the point where, and the Leaf, as a Maverick kind of that likes to run the car down, the Leaf annoyed me a bit because once it goes below I think it's about 10 miles of range or 5%, I can't remember what it is, the display just cuts out. Oh. So that when you're in the low numbers, you have no idea what the car has in the tank still. It just goes to like a blank screen. Yeah. So like, well, I've got 3 miles left. Do I have 3 miles of range? Do I have 4 miles? Do I have 2 miles? I don't know. Anyway, so it went into what's called turtle mode. So it has a little turtle that comes up that says you're basically limping now. So I got to the M25, sort of went round some back streets towards this charge point that I knew I could get to, or I thought I could get to, and I ended up about a mile short of it. Just pulled up at the side of the road and called Nissan assistance. And the time between me running out of range and being at the charging point charging again was 45 minutes, which really wasn't an issue. And I was like, actually, if this is the extent of it, then so be it. And the other time was on the way back down the A1 again. I thought I had enough range to reach charge point that I wanted to get to. But again, I passed like 16, 17 rapid charges on the A1 that I could have stopped at, pushing it, and ran out on the A1. And I was stopped for quite a long that time. I won't say how long. But that's experience. I'm not going to do that again now. But that's just, in both instances, the issue was definitely not a lack of infrastructure. As I say, in both cases, there were at least a dozen, if not 2 dozen charges I could have stopped at, and my journey would have been delayed by like 5 minutes to do that little mini stop to get an extra 10 miles. Like it wouldn't have killed me to do it, but I was just being an idiot. So yes, I've done it. It wasn't, the second time was a lot less pleasant than the first time. But in both cases, I was reckless. I can't, the car wasn't the fault. The infrastructure wasn't the fault. It was me basically chancing it and getting it wrong, basically.
And what happens in that? Because I heard stories, I've not heard any recently, but of the recovery situation. Okay, you could call your recovery person and go, I've run out of juice. I heard previously that certain cars, it was a problem moving them.
So basically, most operators will put you on a flatbed because you are effectively, if you're even in neutral, you're moving motors, right? You can't really freewheel it. The alternative to that is, I can't remember which, I'm not going to say the name because I'll get it wrong and I'll get in trouble. One of the breakdown operators has, I think it's the AA, has a like a freewheeling hub that they can take off. So they could take off like the rear wheels of an EV, for example, put on this freewheeling hub that turns it into freewheeling mode, if you like. Doesn't affect the motor. So there's that option without doing a flatbed. It's not going to be an issue in my mind. I mean, fundamentally, if you think about the number of breakdowns there are going to be, logically there should be way fewer breakdowns with electric cars because they have far, far fewer moving parts. Yeah. So actually, I just don't think it's going to be an issue. The number, as far as I know, the number of people who are, bearing in mind the number of electric cars is going up, there's actually been a downturn in the number of people running out of range. Probably because A, the infrastructure is improving. Less people like me. Longer range electric vehicles, right? And people learning the ropes a bit more. Manufacturers, some of them are getting a bit better with their range estimations, some aren't. But as I say, I mean, it's either very likely at the beginning of ownership I think at the beginning of ownership, and I've looked at probably more public charging data than anyone else in the country, but and home charging data probably as well. But at the beginning of electric vehicle ownership, what we saw is when people first, in my old company, we were looking at home chargers, and we saw home chargers that were going in, and actually public chargers as well. So people who'd signed up for public charging kind of account or whatever, and people had a home charger. And what you always saw was at the beginning of the journey, if you like, so immediately after getting a home charger, immediately after sort of signing up for public charging, people were charging very frequently. So they were doing small charges very often because they were anxious.
Yeah.
And actually, the longer you take that out, over 12 months, over 6 months, people start to charge less frequently, but the bigger charges. So you can see in the data, people are actually trusting the electric vehicle more and going, right, I can actually run this down more. I can do bigger charge. I don't need to charge every day. I can charge every week, whatever. And that's how it typically goes. But I mean, I've done like 26,000 miles in the current electric car I've got, and I was being a bit too trusting in it in a sense, but I was, as I say, I was mostly being reckless. But it's not if you run out of range, you run out of range for the same reasons you run out of fuel. It shouldn't be possible. It shouldn't be something that you do, if you like, by accident. You'd have to have missed a lot of charging points to do it, in my view. Even in quite remote areas, you've usually got, you're within miles of a public charger, typically, not always, but typically. So yeah, I mean, and of course, as a last resort, if you're carrying your 3-pin last resort charger, if you stop somewhere with electricity, the chances are you can get, you'd have a significant delay to get any kind of decent range, but that's the beauty of electricity, is it's kind of everywhere.
You can't unfold a little solar panel, put it on your roof.
You'd be waiting a very long time. You can. There's a company that's doing sort of mobile battery packs that are designed for kind of an urban situation predominantly, where you would sort of maybe have a sort of 30 miles of range in a little mini battery that you basically go out, plug into your car at night time, like a suitcase, and then it charges on the street. You take it back inside in the morning to charge it up again. You drive off and do your daily commute. Quite an innovative little company.
I saw that product. And I can't remember what size the battery pack is, but it's sort of small wheelie suitcase size. Yeah. Now, that's not a very big battery. That's a tiny battery in comparison to a car. Charging your car like that, surely... I just looked at it and went, why would you do that? Because you're just not going to get any range out of it.
Well, I think it's really designed. Well, there's a few applications it's designed for. I think one is, I guess, the emergency kind of thing. Like if I'd had that, I would have been delayed for 45 minutes. I think it is for someone that does a very predictable short range every day. If they don't want to go to a public charge point to do that charging, and they live on the street and they can't home charge, it's quite an interesting idea as to how they could do their daily mileage, basically. I mean, it was about a 6 kilowatt hour pack, I think. It's a company called Zip Charge. And anyway, I mean, my view on this is basically we have to kind of look at all the options in the toolbox. Like
100%.
A little bit no idea is a bad idea. One of the things that we're really interested in, and I'm personally really interested in, is this idea of what we call through street charging. So, there was a great Wattcar survey the other day that said, I think sort of 75%, something like that, was less than 20% of drivers would consider switching if they couldn't get a home charger. Now, about, estimates vary, but something like 40% of people won't be able to get a home charger. Well, won't be able to park off street. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
So let's say 45% of people won't be able to park off street, and therefore won't naturally be able to get a home charger. And even within the people that can, some of those people have to grapple with landlords and everything else.
Yeah.
But for people who park on street outside their home, even if they park outside their house twice a week, not 7 days a week, we're looking at the sort of solution where you could potentially have some kind of gully that is not going to harm the accessibility of people using the pavement for walking, or buggies, or someone who's got a walking stick or mobility impairment, whatever. And you're able to run a cable through that somehow from the property. So you get all the benefits of home charging. So you get the benefit of cheap electricity overnight on a time of use tariff. You get the benefit of solar panels and charging from renewables if you want to. But you can actually do it on on outside your home rather than having to drive a mile to the nearest charge point. That's a really interesting idea. There's various councils that are trialing that now. There's not so many in London. It's mostly ones outside London, so sort of Milton Keynes. I think Oxford's done some. Bath and North East Somerset's doing some now, some trials. Because I think local authorities are realising actually that if they can enable this work, a bit like a drop curb, actually they can kind of keep their hands out of it. They can say, what, as a local authority, do we really want to have loads of contracts for like on-street charging infrastructure with loads of different people and 5-year maintenance agreements on them? And are they going to go wrong in what happens when if the company goes bust in 10 years? What happens? Actually, if they just say, hang on a minute, if we just enable people to do it in their own homes, we can basically just stop. We can sort of stop putting new stuff on the pavement, and it actually speeds things up, because people then, it's on the owners, on the consumer to sort themselves out. All we've got to do is a relatively simple little gully. So there's permitted development for that kind of thing happening in Scotland. So that's quite interesting as a solution, I think, is the idea of home charging for people that currently aren't in that home charging sort of Venn diagram. That's an interesting kind of solution that we're looking at now.
A slight, I don't know what I just thought of, a slight spin on that would be, because we all see these cables, like, people, I've done it. I feel like a lot of people have done it, and you see it all the time. Someone's running a cable out the kitchen window, across the pavement, blocking people trip over it, or whatever. I presume there's a scenario, if you could have gullies and whatnot, and the chargers that are built into lampposts, I think that's great. Like that makes sense. Like, if we can do that, you've highlighted some possible issues in the future with things like that. But if a bunch of houses have a home charger on the wall on the outside of the house, you could have a system where that is rent-outable.
Yeah, absolutely. It's already happening. So one of the companies that's doing this in Milton Keynes, for example, is a company called Turbocharge, and they have a platform where exactly that happens. So you get your gully, you have a charger, and the idea is that you can then use the platform to share that with neighbours. So if you can park outside your house twice a week, that might be enough for your requirements. If your neighbour can park outside twice a week, that's enough for theirs. So you almost end up being able to charge, let's say, 3 or 4 households' cars from one supply. Yeah. And obviously the payments are all reconciled so that you're not paying for everyone else's driving, which wouldn't be very fair. But yeah, that's already happening. In terms of that's a solution for the through street gully. It's already happening at some kind of scale in off-street home charging already. So there's a company called Co-Charger. That's probably the one that's best known, which is doing what is called community charging, where it's like the old park at my house, sort of option, right? Where people kind of rent out their driveway for near Twickenham if someone wants to go and watch a rugby. It's the same thing of you're driving to Bristol, you're going to go somewhere, and actually someone's got a charger on their driveway that's a mile away from where you're going, or half a mile, or whatever. You think, well, actually, I'll just go and pay to park on their drive and charge for the day, and that means my charging's sorted out, because I know if I pay for that, you also know if you've booked it, it's going to be there. Whereas if you're heading for a public charge point and there's only one of them, well, by the time you get there, someone else might be using it, right? So that's the other challenge, I guess, with if you don't have enough public charging infrastructure, that's benefit. So again, we're going to need all the tools in the toolbox. So, rapid and ultra rapid charging isn't going to be the solution for everyone. On-street charging is not going to be the solution for everyone. Community charging isn't going to be the solution for everyone. But if you sort of aggregate all the technologies, that's how you get the full sort of pie, if you like. And I think that's also one of the struggles people have in understanding the infrastructure landscape, is that because we have this homogenous infrastructure of petrol and diesel, if you fill up petrol and diesel, you have to go to this thing called a forecourt, and you have to put this liquid in your car from either a green pump or a black pump, because all the LPG ones being closed now. And it's basically the same experience for everyone, regardless of whether you're a high mileage driver, low mileage driver, luxury car driver, whether you've got a driveway, it doesn't matter, because you can't fill up with petrol at home. So people sort of struggle because they think, well, if we've got this homogenous infrastructure for petrol and diesel, what is the homogenous infrastructure for EVs? And the answer is there isn't one. There is no homogenous infrastructure for EVs. It's going to be like you literally will live next door to someone who will charge in a completely different way from you in many cases. And that's fine. But I think people get a bit worried about it because they go, well, my neighbour can't do what I can do. And you go, okay, so what? If they can charge at work, that might be their main charger if they can charge at work, for example. Yeah.
And lots of people, your cars either, for most people that are driving a lot, unless they're just on the road, the car's either at home or it's at work, in which case it's probably there for a long time. So if you can't charge at home, but you can charge at work, you're solved.
The hardest, the passenger car market is not the hardest market to solve for electrification. The hardest markets to crack are, and obviously a lot of these are already being done, are things like taxis, right? So a lot of black cabs, and a lot of black cabs are actually shared. So a lot of black cabs, not like Ubers, Ubers to some extent, but black cabs in many cases, you'll have drivers splitting them, in 2 shifts a day. So you'll have driver 1 who gets the car for the daytime shift, and then driver 2 takes it for the nighttime shift. So that car is literally in pretty much 24/7 operation. Yeah, okay, it has some downtime, it has some 5-10 minute breaks, but those drivers are trying to eke every minute of use out of that vehicle. They're the challenge to electrify, because when you're looking for when's the time opportunity to charge that car, that vehicle, it gets tricky. For passenger cars, it should be a doddle, right? Because we know that they spend 90% of their lives doing nothing. So if a car is doing nothing, it's a great time to charge it, whether it's at work, at home, at a gym, whatever. But if it's parked and doing nothing, let's charge it basically, or let's look at whether we can charge it. The vehicles that don't spend much time parked, they're more of the challenge. That's why I'm not an electric absolutist. I think, I don't think hydrogen passenger cars make much sense. But actually, if you look at 44 tonners that come into the port, from Calais to Dover, and basically want to do about 1,200 miles on a tank, and go back to France again and not fill up, you're like, well, if that's their model today, can we electrify them? Okay, can we electrify them fairly easily? I know they have to take breaks every kind of 4 hours or whatever, but can we electrify them? Is maybe hydrogen the answer for really heavy trucks? I don't know the answer to that question, but I do. I scratch my head a bit more when I look at things like 44 tonners and say, could that really be electrified at scale? I know there's lots of companies doing trialing those and doing small fleets at the moment, but is that going to work for all of the applications? I'm not sure.
Yeah, there's always going to be, isn't it? It's this sort of situation where you're like, you've got the whole of the world and all of the infrastructure and whatnot, and passenger cars is a chunk of it, and that's probably one of the easiest. It's one of the easiest ones to electrify, and to do the others, it's going to take time, technology, and whether electricity ends up being the ultimate situation.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. It's just, can we get to the least amount of sort of emissions and whatnot as possible? And ultimately, we'll end up hopefully with tankers not cruising around on bunker fuel at some point in time. But when we can change that stuff, don't know. But at the same time, we've got to move forwards.
And I mean, unless there are people that dispute the fact that there's any kind of urgency around tackling emissions, right, and tackling environmental pollution, etc. And I think it's very difficult to kind of create a constructive dialogue with a lot of those people sometimes. But assuming you're in the vast majority that do think we need to take some kind of action, if you look at the big pie chart and go, right, where are the problems? Where are the big emission hotspots? That's why as a company we're focused on those two areas. Really, is one is transport, and if you look at transport, it's road transport. We obviously know aviation is kind of out of scope. So it's incredibly difficult to kind of work out whether that plane's pollution happened in the UK or happened in France. But if you look at road transport, the biggest, they're not the most polluting vehicle on a per vehicle basis, but the biggest chunk of emissions are obviously coming from private cars. So again, getting rid of the emissions from those is taking away a big chunk of the pie chart. That's not to say that we're saying that we're not targeting a hybrid private car owner versus a big diesel truck owner. We're not saying that you're a worse polluter. It's just that in the aggregate, that's the issue. And then in the other side, the other big kind of chunk of emissions obviously is coming from buildings and heating. And of that, it's domestic heating, right? It's basically heating our homes and heating our hot water systems. Yeah, creates a massive amount of emissions. And in fact, for the average home, at the moment in the UK, your emissions footprint from if someone says to me, what should I do first, Tom? Should I basically electrify my heating and water system or electrify my vehicle? The automated person in me, the EV guy, wants to say, oh yeah, get an EV. But actually, if you really want to create a dent in your emissions, you should probably electrify your heating and hot water first, because that's probably a bigger emitter than your vehicle for the average car. If you're doing 40,000 miles a year, it won't be. But if you're the average driver, it will be. Yeah. But the issue is obviously, how many times do we look at a gas flue coming out of a side of a house in a week? Probably never. How many times do we see an exhaust pipe spitting out, burnt fuel? A couple of times a week, probably, at least every day, maybe. So it's a much more visible form of pollution, because we're sat there going, crikey, look at that car in front. Whereas most people don't go to their neighbour's house and go, crikey, look at all those emissions coming out of their gas boiler. But they're there.
You also, if you go around someone's house, and this is where the problem has so many levels, is you go around someone's house and it's warm inside and it's cold outside. You're like, this is nice. You don't see that maybe their house, ignoring the temperature and whatever, is the actual house is incredibly inefficient for whatever reasons. Whether it's I lived in a part of London that was in a conservation area, and they were really annoying about changing windows. And you're like, I'm sorry,
Makes no
what
sense.
century do we live in where me wanting to put in triple glazing versus single panes, like, why is that even a question?
It's crazy, isn't it?
But
crazy.
You know, we look at all this stuff and you go, okay, yeah, you might have a big gas bill, but no one knows about it. Whereas driving around a massive truck, people go, you're driving a massive truck. I can see you're driving through a town. It is a complicated one, and it's not easy. It's not easy, and it's not cheap for a person at home to sort of fix these issues.
Yeah, and that's true. I think the capital. I mean, there's a few things that are coming to market in terms of funding models, etc., which are making it better. But historically, I'd say if you look at a new car buyer, for a few years now, I would argue for a new car buyer or a user chooser in a fleet, business car, driver, whatever, the financial argument of switching to an EV is pretty moot. Like it's not really. I mean, it'll either save you money or it certainly shouldn't cost you a lot more to switch to an EV. Whereas obviously investing in a lot of home technology versus not investing in it is obviously a big marginal cost. But we're seeing some interesting models coming around, things like solar at the moment. So you only need to spend a few minutes on social media to see companies bombarding you, if you're in my kind of sector, with messages about no upfront cost solar. So there are various companies now that are looking at models where they effectively do some clever maths, work out what you're going to save on your bills, and kind of create a financing package that meets that. So you end up paying finance, but your finance payments are mitigated by the amount you're saving on your bill. Right? That's kind of the idea of it.
Nice way of doing it.
Which kind of works. You obviously got some help on things like electrifying heat, but $5,000 from the government is certainly not going to cover the average cost of, say, a heat pump for most homes yet. I mean, there are companies saying they're going to do a £3,000 heat pump, or they're going to try and get it down to the point where you only have to pay, equivalent to a new gas boiler in addition to the grant. But, the grants can't stay forever. So we really need to be working out ways to kind of amortize those costs in the longer term. But yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I get for solar. I mean, I've just got solar panels installed back in Feb, and everyone, the first question you say is, they say, how long are they going to take to pay back? And you go, well, I could work that out, but it's a long-term investment that's going to give me some utility. And in the same way that no one has ever asked anyone in the history of kitchens, if you pay 15 grand for a new kitchen, no one's ever going to go, what's the payback on your new kitchen? What's the payback on that new? And, it's just a kitchen. It's just, and actually, in the same way, someone says, well, Tom, because I like to talk about the fact that you can generate solar energy at zero marginal cost, and I do tend to at least qualify it by saying marginal cost. And I get criticised by people saying, well, it's not zero marginal cost because you have to pay £3,000 for your solar panels. And I go, yeah, but if you extend that argument, that's like saying that if you're home cooking versus getting a takeaway, you should actually, if you're home cooking, you should take into account the cost of your kitchen, because you couldn't cook at home, you didn't have a kitchen. So actually, it sort of gets a bit stupid, because it's just an investment, and it's only the investment for the first buyer, because obviously once the solar panels are there and they've got they'll be there for decades. Actually, the second home, the person that then buys that home, that is just amortizing the cost of their mortgage, right, or whatever, or their rent. So they don't even pay. For them, it truly is zero cost electricity. It's zero marginal cost, zero cost electricity, because they didn't even pay for the panels on their own. They paid for it as part of the overall house, right? So the quicker we get this stuff out there, the quicker it will all kind of effectively get amortized into mortgages, rents, etc., and people will stop sort of getting so focused on the capital cost, because it won't be a capital cost anymore, I guess.
Yeah, I'm in the process of doing somewhere up that we've just bought. We're going to move into at some point, and I'm waiting to see, because I've said to them, look, I want to do, as much as possible. Ideally, and I think a lot of people, you'll be able to tell me, go on this journey of you've had an EV, you've charged it at home, you get used to charging at home. You then slightly find going to a petrol station a bit weird, because you never go. Or like, if for most of my journeys, I never go. I just come back home, plug the car in, job done. Or if I use a petrol car, last a certain amount of time, then you're like, I've got to go just to go to the petrol station. But you start, and I love all sorts of tech, so I start digging into the size of the battery and whatever. And actually, I think that's an interesting point. I've seen some pushback on people going, I've got to learn a whole bunch of new lingo and words, and do I really need to know about charging speeds and charging? They wouldn't say charging graphs because they wouldn't know what that is. But what's the difference between a kilowatt hour and a kilowatt and all this sort of stuff? My theory on that is, over time, hopefully you won't necessarily need to know very much, but you will need to know, because it's a new language. It's a new subject matter. You pick up something new. You're learning about, I've got an audio thing in my hand and I learn like, oh, okay, that's the input. I've learned a new thing. It's the way of life.
I liken it to like smartphones, right? In that when everyone had like, I don't know, if you go back to like the early 2000s, right? And I remember like writing essays on very early computers and stuff, PCs. Because I was a bit of a nerd, I probably did know what spec the computer was and how much RAM it had and what the hard drive size was. But most people would have just had a home PC and they wouldn't have known how big the hard drive was. They wouldn't have known about gigabytes, whatever, right?
Tiny.
But as soon as you get a smartphone, it's like, oh, well, how much storage has it got? Oh, 256 gigabytes. Oh, I want 512 gigabytes.
Yeah.
So actually people have learned new, like, if you want to call it jargon, people have learned a new language around new products. I bet most people know the term 4K. I don't know what it means, but I bet more people know the term 4K or OLED or whatever.
HD.
Yeah, like people know that a certain thing is better than another thing, right? 3G, 4G, 5G. People have learned these things. People know about megabytes per second because they have broadband and they get pissed off when it's low megabytes per second or whatever. So actually, people do learn this stuff. What I actually think is more confusing is when you try to infantilize the language and say, well, let's just call it fast charging or standard charging. And actually, that doesn't help anyone, because what they need to know is how quickly is it going to fill my battery and how quickly is it going to go. And it's actually like the maths is way simpler than, hang on, we sell petrol and diesel in litres, and how do we measure car efficiency? In miles per gallon.
Oh, like, does my head
hang on. So for decades, we've all managed to talk about gallons and the fact that we don't buy fuel in gallons. It's just, I love the idea that somehow electric cars are the thing that's complicating this and not petrol and diesel sales. But anyway, I don't think it'll be a long-term problem. And I do think that people will just have to learn the sort of speeds. But unless you're a motoring journalist and you're going from different cars to different car every single week with a different size battery and a different size charging speed, it won't be an issue for you, because you'll have your E208 with a 45 kilowatt hour usable pack, and you'll go, right, so I've got 45 kilowatt hours of usable energy. That's what I need to know for the next 2 years. I'm going to change my car for 2 years. So I know that if I head to a 100 kilowatt charger, I will theoretically be able to get maximum speed, and I might be able to charge it in about half an hour. Whereas if I go to a 50 kilowatt charger and I've got a 45 kilowatt hour pack, it'll be more like an hour. That's kind of all you need to know. And once you've absorbed that information and it's taken you 5 minutes to do it, you don't have to go and relearn it tomorrow. It hasn't changed in a week. That's your car for probably a year, 2 years, 3 years. So it's not that hard for most people, but it probably is going to be more of a challenge if you're, as I say, a motoring journalist who's going from a 30 kilowatt hour pack to a 40 kilowatt hour pack to a 100 kilowatt hour pack, and you have a press car that has 350 kilowatt charging, and the next week you have a press car that only has 100 kilowatt charging. Okay. It's the road tester's dilemma.
It's quite. I was going to say it's quite easy though. Like once you've got the base kind of language of like what we're dealing with, it all lines up. It all, like, the battery size is equated to the stuff you're putting in, like,
it's
and the
primary
speed.
School maths.
It's primary school maths. All the units align. Whereas as your point about fuel and liters and gallons, and the fact that there's a UK gallon and a US gallon, and that just really does my head in.
Yeah. I think the other thing is that consumers have suddenly got a lot more aware of kilowatts and kilowatt hours or kilowatt hours at least, because of their energy bills going up so much, right, in recent years. So suddenly everyone knows a lot more about electricity than they did 2 years ago. Good. That's a good thing. It's a silver lining out of the whole problem. And what's the terrible stuff that's gone on in Ukraine, for example, is people have actually learned more about energy and are realizing they don't want to be dependent on Russian oil and gas for the next decade. And people, the more and more people adopt solar. So solar sales in the UK grew faster than EV sales last year. So home solar sales went up by something like 250% last year. So as soon as people get solar, you can be damn sure they're going to go, right, how many kilowatts I've got on the roof? What am I generating? And, for the techie in the household, whoever that is, it doesn't, regardless of your gender, that whoever is going to be looking at that technology, day to day, week to week, they will be looking at how much have I generated? What's the sun doing on my roof right now? All that sort of stuff. So that will get you into the energy mindset too. So I just think it's like it's like learning computer language, learning the language of smartphones. It's just the next technology that people are going to start learning about. And as you say, that the metrics all line up. They're all they are metrics, and it's not gonna be a challenge for people to kind of retain the information. I think people make a real meal of how much jargon there is, but actually there really isn't. And if as I say, the biggest jargon problem is where you use words, yes, and everyone uses a different word. One company says ultra rapid, one company says ultra fast, one company says high powered. Yeah. Fast charging on the continent is what we call rapid charging in the UK. That's the issue. If you actually use the numbers, then it all levels out if you use the numbers.
Yeah, it's that one. It's like bringing it back to TVs. That has done my head in. As someone who makes videos and whatever, like 1080p is a resolution. It's like a size of a number of dots, and then you get 4K and 8K, whatever. When you go, oh, it's HD, and then it's full HD, and then it's ultra HD. Everyone just, like, once you've got that point and you look at the TVs, people go, huh? Like, what? What am I talking about? I have no idea whatsoever. It doesn't make any sense. And it's exactly the same with fast charging, ultra, whatever, any iteration of that. Because I imagine a lot of people, I went the other day, did a journey. This was an interesting one because it was the first long back to home journey I've done in my E208 in a while. All the other ones I've like either charged at a destination or strung it out and gone, okay, I know this is on the edge. I'm going to drive at like 65 and carefully, and I should be able to get home. And then you hit a diversion that's plus 10 miles and you have an interesting day. But that was all fine. But on this journey, I knew that I was going to go further than I could. And I stopped at a big services. And this is an interesting point about having an EV versus a petrol car. Petrol car, you fill it up. Let's just say you fill it till full and you run it till empty and then you fill it till full. It doesn't really matter when you fill it up because you're always going to have to fill it up when it's empty. So you've driven a certain amount of miles and you're going to have to go to a petrol station. Whereas an EV is a completely different shift if you can charge at home or let's say work or wherever. It's a continuous round loop back to base, I would say most of the time. And you only need to get home. So if you get home on 0, I think all of us, you'll probably be like, yes, I've nailed it. Like I've spent the least amount of money away from home. And charging at home is the cheapest. So actually on my, let's say 200-mile journey, I knew I was probably going to be able to get about 140 miles out of the car, something like that. At some point in time, I want to charge. But it doesn't really matter how deep into the journey, let's just say over a third, over half maybe, I need to charge. But other than that, it doesn't matter. So you can pick your charging points accordingly and plan your journey. But it is a very different plan to, well, just popping in and filling up or whatever. But the whole shift is really different.
It's definitely a top up rather than a fill up. Although, I mean, I say fill up culture. I mean, the last internal combustion car I had was a diesel A6 in my sort of two jobs ago, I guess. And I did about 40,000 miles a year. So I was spending the company was spending a lot of money on diesel. And I did fill up to empty pretty much, right? I did fill it up, drive it as far as it could go pretty much down to the red light, and I'd go and fill up again. Most people do not do that. Most people. So the average fill, bearing in mind this, most small petrol tanks or diesel tanks on the market are like 40 litres.
Yeah.
The average fill, and this is a figure I got in my previous role, given that it was part of an electric business that was part of an oil and gas company. The average fill is 20 litres on a forecourt. That's the average.
Yeah.
Because actually most people get to about half and they go, I've only got a third of a tank. I need to fill up.
Do they actually?
Yeah. Because most people do not run their cars down to the red light or the fuel warning light and then fill up again. Or if they do that, particularly in the cost of living crisis, if they are running it down to the fuel light, they're certainly not spending 60 quid to fill it up again. They're actually spending 30 quid or whatever, 40 quid to fill up 20 or so litres. And then they're using that 20 litres and they're doing it again. So however they run it, most people are not filling the tank. So that really annoys me when people go, how long does it take to charge the car fully? And you go, the only time you're ever going to charge the car fully is at home, or at a destination where you're low and you literally want to chop it away. If you're out and about, if you're doing rapid charging, you're not going to be charging the car, even from 0 to 80, you're not going to be doing that. In almost any case, you're going to be going from like 30% to 70%, maybe. Yeah. That's kind of the model. So we used to kind of look at those metrics of, and actually, that sounds a bit stupid, we were like, if you worked out the average, so let's say 20 litres is less than 5 gallons, isn't it? So 4 and a bit gallons, something like that. So basically, what we did was work out that so the average dwell time on a forecourt is about 7 minutes, end to end, right? Yeah. So it doesn't take 7 minutes to fill the car, but the whole stopping process is about 7 minutes. So you're parked for 7 minutes, basically. If the average fill is 20 litres, and that will take you, let's say, 150 miles. Yeah. Ish, probably let's be generous and say maybe 200 miles, right? So between 150 and 200 miles, depending on the efficiency of the car, and that's 7 minutes. Well, actually, ultra rapid charging now, even at 150 kilowatt technology and a reasonably efficient car, 100 miles in 10 minutes is easily possible. In fact, 150 miles in 10 minutes is doable. That's today. That's not like 5 years' time. That's today. Yeah. So hang on a minute. We're saying that 7 minutes average drop on a forecourt for an average fill of about 150 miles, 200 miles, and yet we can get 150 miles in 10 minutes for an EV charger? Whoa, hang on a minute. The gap is way smaller than most people think. So yes, you can go and fill up a car completely in that 7 minutes. You could go and do a full fueling transaction and get, and there are people that have told me they've got 1,200 mile range ICEs. Okay. I think I'm pretty sure that's longer than the world record, actually, that I think like Andrew Frankel set by driving an Audi over Europe. Rebecca Jackson and Andrew Frankel, I think, did a journey a while ago in an Audi A6 where I think they did. I can't remember if that was a world record on the tank, but maybe it was a number of countries they did on a tank. I can't remember. Yeah. But that most people are not getting 1,200 miles on a tank. Let's be very, very generous and say that most people can get about 500 miles on average out of a tank, maybe 6, but 500 miles on average. I know my wife's old petrol cleared at about 350 on tanks, something like that, 400. That means you could go and get 500 miles of range in about 7 minutes. But how many people? You have to say how many people do that. And actually, the flip side is that vast minority that go and get 600 miles of range in 7 minutes on a forecourt. Well, look at all the benefit of the vast majority of people that will be able to get, or the majority, maybe not the vast majority of people that will be able to get charged at home, and they won't even notice how long it's taken because they'll be asleep. So it's very easy to shoot holes in the charging time thing, but actually, when you sort of look at the reality of who actually does that, it's tiny numbers of people. Very few people get a little bit of fuel, and very few people get loads of fuel. It's a bell curve, and it's the same for EV charging. Very few people do like. The people that do like 3-4 kilowatt hour top ups are usually people who have got their EV for the first time and they're testing the public charge point. Yeah. And the people who get like 70 kilowatt hours are usually private hire drivers in London that are knackering their car. You've kind of got to look at the data and say, just because someone could go and get 600 miles of range in 7 minutes, are any real people doing that on a really regular basis? And the answer is no, they're not.
Yeah, you've got these. It's like everyone always brings up the edge cases, and I was listening to some stuff about America recently or whatever, but like it'll be like, and I think we do it with all aspects of our life. I 100% do it with cars. You go, I need a car big enough to hold all of the stuff that I might carry the longest distance in 1 year. Or the 5 years that I'm going to own the car for. Yeah. If on one day I move house and I travel 1,000 miles, I need to be able to fit all my stuff in that car for that one day to do 1,000 miles. And we all do it. I think a lot of people do it, and then it's just varying degrees, and it always comes out as an argument about the range or the whatever. And I'm starting to get a bit of, I don't know whether it's like technology paralysis or purchasing paralysis around EVs right now, because I know what I've done with my E208, and it's actually been great. If it hadn't been a lease, I would have kept it, but it's going back, so I've got to look at the wider thing. I'm seeing the pace. There's two things: the pace of technology change is significant, and I kind of know a lot about EVs now, so I know like if it can accept. I was with a Rimac Nevera recently, actually, and I was asking one of the people about it, and he was saying that can charge at 500 kilowatts.
Yeah.
Now there were basically no 500 kilowatts, but the bit that I found interesting, and I'd not really clocked, is like I said, I was asking him about the nav and whether it preconditions the battery and whatever, and he was like, you don't do it. Doesn't matter. He's like, we can precondition the battery really fast, but you can pull up to a 350 kilowatt charger and you will get 350 kilowatts. It will just take it. Boom.
Yeah.
No problem. And it's because it can charge at 500. It's like, it can take 500. So it's only running at half speed. It's no problem.
Yeah. And I'd say, and as I say, when you talk about kind of range, people sort of say now, range anxiety isn't a thing, it's charge anxiety. And actually the only reason anyone criticizes the range of electric cars, because we know that there are performance cars out there. Someone the other day was saying, I've got an Audi RS4 and I can do 300 miles on a tank. So there are now EVs on the market that have a longer range than my Audi RS4. Nobody in the history of Audi RS4 journalism has ever said that an Audi RS4 has a short range. But because you can fill it up in 7 minutes, doesn't matter. So it's charging time is actually a way bigger issue than range, in my view, of a car. So I would happily get a lower range EV that could charge faster. Personally, if Jaguar had an I-Pace in the market that had mine's got a 90 kilowatt hour, that's 84ish usable. If they said we've actually got one on the market that's got a 70 kilowatt hour usable battery, so significantly smaller, but it can charge at 200 kilowatts, I'd go, yeah, I'll take it tomorrow. Because actually, for me, that the utility of faster charging is number one. That's brilliant. And actually, unless you do it all the time, unless you're doing it literally all the time, you're not going to see any real degradation over the life of the vehicle anyway, that's significant enough to warrant battery replacement or anything dramatic like that. So I would definitely go for that. And I think where we are now with cars that are around the sort of 250, 300 kilowatt charging speeds, that's kind of where we need to be. I don't think it's going to go far beyond that, because actually you're then pushing the limits of battery voltage and stuff. And I don't think we need to do that. It's sort of fast enough. But that's the level at which we need to get to, is that almost equivalence with the average ICE refuel, I guess. And again, I know Lotus came out with this 500 kilowatt charger at the Shanghai Motor Show the other day, and probably the same reason, right? Is that it means you can go to a 350 kilowatt charger and pretty much know you're going to get 350 because the car could accept a lot higher.
Yeah.
So that makes sense to me. And Audi was talking about this ages ago about downsizing battery packs and going, actually, from a resource conservation point of view, it's way better for us to make two 50 kilowatt hour EVs that can charge at 300 kilowatts than make 100 kilowatt hour EV that can only charge at 100 kilowatts. Just makes more sense. So there's an interesting thing there, and efficiency will play a bigger role as well. And rightly, there's a lot of OEMs that have been, there's a few that have been criticised for very inefficient EVs in the last few years.
Hummer EV. Huh? The Hummer.
Well, yeah. Well, I'm close to home, I'm thinking, but yeah. There's a few. There was one I had. I'm not going to embarrass it, but where I was genuinely getting probably less than 2 miles per kilowatt hour at some points, and that's horrific for a fairly standard passenger vehicle. That is if you're getting under 2 miles per kilowatt hour, that's horrendous. It's not bad. That's horrendous. So we need to see OEMs upping their game on efficiency and like driveline efficiency and making drivelines more efficient, because it's a bit like a Hemi or something, right? You actually, and all of these like performance cars ended up with like cylinder shutoff technology, because most of the time you actually want the car in like eco mode. It's going to do 5 miles per hour. Yes, give it the ability to absolutely knock it out of the park. And if you want to get it on track and do 1.5 miles per hour, fine. But actually, most of the time, people don't want it in maximum attack mode. They want it in I'm driving around town, I'm going shopping mode. So that almost mindset needs to come to EVs of actually we need to make the most efficient drive line we can in this mode, and actually have the ability for someone to change the mode to put it in, give me all the power mode. But actually, all these 500-600 brake horsepower EVs that are coming to market, in my mind, probably need to be dialed down to like 200 horsepower at most of the time. Like for motorway driving, anything else, I don't need, like my e-Niro is perfectly, that was like 200 horsepower. That was perfectly capable of any journey at all the speeds I would want, sort of thing. That I didn't need any more power than that. And I've got an I-Pace with about 400 now. I certainly don't. All the stuff coming out to market now, it's got 556. I think, really? I mean,
isn't that a factor of? I heard somewhere that if you have a bigger motor and you're running it slower, it's more efficient than running a small motor fast. So lots of these speeds and horsepower, old school metric numbers for these EVs are just a byproduct.
Exactly of what it could do. So as long as there's that sort of like gearing, if you want to call it, in there to reduce it down when it needs to be reduced, I think that's really important for OEMs to think about, which some of these EVs didn't have, and they were giving you maximum attack all the time, which wasn't very helpful. But I mean, it's a bit like I've had that in ICEs, right? I had for a while, I had a downsized turbo petrol Insignia back in the day, and it was awful. It was like 25 miles per gallon awful.
Yeah.
Because I was hammering around motorways all the time. So it was a 1.4 turbo petrol thing. And then I had a press from the press fleet. I had when they were still in the UK, I had the Camaro press car on point. This is back in about 2012, I don't know.
Yeah.
I took it down to Goodwood, and I remember going to collect it in Luton. I drove it back home to Kent, and I got 30 miles per gallon on the motorway from Luton to Kent, and I was like, "What?" Because it was a big old 6.2 V8 that was just burbling at barely tick over all the way home on motorway speeds. It wasn't doing any work. So it's the same principle, I think. And I think that's probably why it does make more sense to sort of maybe over motor something, but give it the right settings and modes and sort of gearings to be able to not perform all of that, not need all that motor speed all the time, basically, I guess.
And it does throw out some of the, like, one of the reasons why I want a small car for town, but also I quite like having a small car. And generally, historically, small cars have been more efficient because the engines, let's say the engine techs are similar across, and they're smaller, moving less mass, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But we've got this situation where I look at the E208 and it's like, it's pretty good, but I could buy a Tesla Model 3 or a bunch of bigger kind of crossover type cars, whether you want one or not, that's a different decision. But like, you can buy a bigger, blockier looking car that could in theory be as efficient or more efficient. So that's another factor that comes into it. Because I go, well, if I'm getting a small car, because I kind of want it to be efficient and small, but it's less efficient, like genuinely less efficient than a bigger car, I should just be getting the bigger car.
Yeah. Yeah. It is weird. It's a weird thing, really, where that happens. But yeah, I mean, and that's why I say, I think, I don't think big batteries are where the obsession should be. I think the obsession should be in efficient drivelines, so efficient powertrains, which I think the Koreans have nailed bluntly, and in fast charging technology. So moving to 800 volt architecture, and I mean, Hyundai was massively ballsy in going 800 volt architecture, or Hyundai and Kia, I should say, in the mainstream, because I reckon until about 2019, maybe, I can't remember when they announced it actually, but the industry at large, I would say, was pretty convinced that 800 volt architecture was going to be the preserve of like Aston, because I think Aston had done their Rapide prototype, and we were like, it's probably going to be the luxury end, right? And then suddenly Hyundai and Kia go out and say, we're going to move to 800 volt architecture for our mainstream passenger cars. And everyone's like, whoa, okay, that's game changing. Suddenly we're all thinking about rolling out ultra rapid charging instead then. And I mean kind of 300 kilowatt plus charging. So I think that was really important to kind of get the industry in that mindset that we need to be moving to faster charging vehicles. And obviously, when you move to higher voltage architecture, you also have the benefits that you can do the higher powered charging with less stress on the battery actually as well in many cases. So that's a benefit. But I think if you can get a more, given that a lot of the concerns around EVs are around resources and materials and mining and so on, if you can basically get more vehicles out of every bit of raw material, that's got to be better, right? So if you can double the efficiency of an EV, that's massive. That's game changing. And simultaneously, if you can get the charging speeds up as well, because again, if you can get the efficiency better, you don't need to do anything with the charging speeds because it's like my Kia could. I'm just trying to think if that's through now. So my Kia could charge a maximum of about 76 kilowatts, something like that, I think.
Yeah.
And my I-Pace can do, on paper, it can do 104, but actually I've got it up to about 116 before. But the Kia can charge faster in the way I call it is the Kia can actually charge faster in terms of miles per minute.
Yeah.
Because it's more efficient, it can actually, even at that lower charge rate, it can still get me going quicker. That's the thing, is actually you're like, well, my car can do this charging rate. And you're like, yeah, but if it's inefficient, it doesn't matter because I can be gone from it's like Formula One strategy, right? It's basically I can be out of the pits quicker than you because I've got my 50 miles of range quicker than you have.
Yeah.
Even though my car's got a lower charging speed. And that's the other thing people haven't come into mind. And I've seen a lot of company car fleets now say we are basically getting all of the OEMs to give us much richer data on real world efficiency because we want our company car drivers to order efficient EVs because we don't want them to have to pay so much for charging costs, etc. So people are getting more obsessed with it now, rightly. And the OEMs that aren't delivering efficient EVs are going to find themselves in a bit of trouble, basically, I think.
Well, and the amounts of power we're talking about, like as soon as we've had all the pricing changes around home stuff and just general electricity prices, I think people are more aware. But if you start using an EV, you get a real tangible, real world, like what amount of power am I using to drive somewhere? And then you come back home and go, what amount of power am I using at home? And you get like an idea. And then you also learn that in your EV, you're using a ton of power. Yeah. And when you look at like you say, my ideal is to have the battery pack as small as possible, but be more efficient because you're like, if I could just charge from a 3-pin and it was a 20 kilowatt hour battery pack, it's not going to take that long to charge it.
Yeah. Well, that's the weird. Yeah. And in a way, the weird thing is that we've had that obsession in ICEs, right? Because standard fuel. I mean, there was a famous. I can't remember which OEM it was. I think it was one of the German OEMs, but I'm not going to say here in case I get it wrong. They did a press release a while back where I think they said we've made the car this much lighter, and then you read into it, and they'd made the fuel tank smaller, and the reduction in the fuel tank size equated to the reduction in. You're like, so you've made the car lighter by making the fuel tank smaller. Well done. Or they'd said we've increased the range of the car or efficiency. We've increased, but they'd done it by increasing the fuel tank size. I can't remember. But there was that obsession with, because most fuel tanks are fairly standard sizes, right? People have either got a sort of 45-ish litre or they've got a 70-ish litre, or you maybe have the 90-odd litres, right? But you've kind of got this like fairly approximate industry standard sizing around fuel tanks. I don't know why that was, by the way. I'm not sure if there's some sort of guideline out there that says how big a fuel tank ought to be. And therefore, the engineers went, right, how do we get the maximum amount of miles out of that amount of energy, that amount of liquid energy? So we almost need that mentality of, right, let's assume you're constrained by a 50 kilowatt hour pack. Now give us the maximum range you can get from a 50 kilowatt hour pack, please. That's the kind of mentality we need. But instead, the mentality is, we'll just shove some extra modules on. We'll just make a bigger battery. No, because not only is that resource inefficient, it's also weight inefficient. And obviously weight is bad for efficiency, weight is bad for safety, et cetera, et cetera. So actually, and it's worth things like tire wear, right? But there doesn't seem to be as big a focus on that as there has been with ICEs, which is weird given that was all the focus there was on ICEs for the last decade or two of ICE development. It was all around efficiency and reducing emissions per mile.
It is completely mad. So this is another, when you're giving people words, you're saying fast charging, you're saying the range. And I think one thing with range is it's done by an independent testing group, whatever. You've got WLTP and then whatever the American one is, EPA. So it's not the manufacturer. So when they say this is the range and it's a WLTP of 300 miles and you get 200 on a cold day down a motorway, or 150 if you're going 80 or something, you can't go back to the manufacturer and go, you told me it was 300. It's like, the way they've measured it is ridiculous for that use case. And then there's like you said, the efficiency just doesn't get put. The efficiency should be put on the windscreen. And when they say, oh, it'll do 400 miles of range, or let's just say, I'm taking this Hummer because it's a ridiculous example of a car that is ridiculous.
Yeah.
And they say, oh, it's fine. You'll get 300. You get 300 miles of range. And then you go, yeah, but you've kind of put if we bring it back to combustion cars, it's like saying it'll get 300 miles of range, but I've put a 400-liter tank in it.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, that's going to take me a really long time to fill up. That's
and
probably
expensive.
massive.
Yeah.
It's heavy. Like,
I totally agree. I mean, I think I'd love more manufacturers to just be more upfront, really publicly in their marketing about expected real-world range.
Yes.
I have to praise BMW on this because they did a really good job with the i. I mean, the i3, I used to have an i3 and I still miss it because I'm not sure I could get on with it with those back doors with 2 kids. But it's an amazing car. You know, the manufacturing of it, the kind of cradle to grave approach on the manufacturing side was great, and the marketing was very, very honest because BMW from the get go. I think the one I had was the sort of 33 kilowatt hour, 94 amp hour battery, and I think the range on it. Again, like, you know, the NEDC or whatever it was at the time, maybe it was I think it was NEDC still at that point. It was about 195 miles from a 33 kilowatt hour. No way you were going to get that. No way you were going to get more than 6 miles per hour. And BMW said in their marketing materials, this wasn't like a line in the press release. This was very public, that you would expect to get about, I think it was 125 miles of range.
Yeah.
And the maximum I ever got out of it was 126, I think, on my best ever range, best ever journey with it. And I think that's a really good way to be open with customers. Say, look, this is the laboratory test, and what we think you'll get is this. And now, obviously, yes, of course, some manufacturers might be more optimistic than others, and how do you kind of benchmark that? But I think if a manufacturer is honest and says, look, this is what we expect you to get, they'll face much less criticism than they're getting today for what are they? They're not in control of it. I mean, I don't blame them. They're not in control of it. They're not. There was a story in the Daily Mail about a guy who had a Mustang Mach-E and was saying, well, I was promised 350 miles of range. You weren't promised that. No one said you were promised that, but it's on the brochure, right?
And if you drove in a vacuum at 40 miles an hour, that's what you get.
Yeah. So yeah, it is a challenge. But I think they could all do with being a bit more honest. And actually, in the same way that most people didn't buy, I think the range thing is going to fall away as a concern, because once you get over 200 miles, I think most consumers just go, fine, that's enough.
Yeah.
Over 300 miles, so that's enough. Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether it's 320, 330, I don't care. So I don't think it's going to become the big differentiator anymore. It's not going to be like if a manufacturer says, we expect you to get 300 miles, and another one says 350. The one that says 350 isn't going to sell way more cars because of that, in my view. People are going to start going, what else can the car do? How fast can it charge? Does it do vehicle to grid? Has it got, I don't know, faster charging? Has it got other features that I would want? Battery preconditioning, remote preconditioning, whatever. I think it's all going to be the other differentiators that sell the car, not the range. So I don't think manufacturers need to be nervous about being honest about the range figure, because in the long run, they'll get much more benefit from the consumer thanking them, if you like, for it, than they will at the moment by saying, well, don't blame us, it's the WLTP figure. Well, yeah, but it's such a big concern for people who are making the switch right now that there needs to be more openness around it.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's managing expectations. And certain manufacturers, I think Mercedes, if you look at EPA rating, which and then a lot of this testing has been done by people in the States as well, and in Europe, but the EPA rating is pretty much, that seems to be, if you look at that number, I look at a car and go, yeah, I think it's going to get that. It's going to do that. And Mercedes, it seem to be really like hitting the numbers that they say, like big style, or getting more. But that's it. It's just, you've sold me a product. If you tell me a number, it needs to get that number. I need to, like with the Peugeot, there was a lot of learning because the readout was just wrong. Like just it's not correct. It seems to have got slightly better over time, so I don't know whether it's learning over time.
Yeah.
So you then end up doing some maths. You go, right, I know it's got a 46 kilowatt hour battery. I know I've got 50%, and then I know my efficiency, and that's how far I will go. You do those sorts of calculations, but it'd be nice if all of the cars did it. So many manufacturers
my
do it well.
rough rule of thumb is basically that most cars are going to get about 3 to 3.5, like on average. If you just drive them normally, and you're not a saint, you're not hypermiling, you're not doing 60 mile an hour behind a lorry, most EVs are going to get roughly in that ballpark of sort of 3 to 4. Let's call it 3.5 as an average. But obviously, with the tailoring of that, if it's a bigger luxury EV, it's more towards the 3, and if it's a lighter, more Korean EV, it's more towards the 4. But anything outside that is sort of either terrible or extremely optimistic. If it's 2, it's terrible, and if someone's promising you 5 or 6, particularly journalists just need to call it out as BS and say that this car is not going to get an average of 5 or 6 with most people. So let's be honest. Let's just say that now, because it's not just the physics doesn't go in their favour. So. I think if people just sort of have that figure in their head to go, well, look, most cars are going to get about 3 to 4. Battery pack is X, therefore 3 to 4 times X is about this. So I know my bracket of range, right? I know that my bracket, if we've got 40 kilowatt hour battery, I know I'm going to get between 120 and 160 miles. That's kind of okay. I know that now. But yeah, I think there needs to be a bit better communication around that. But again, because a lot of technology is new, it's not, the media don't necessarily know what to question yet either. Yeah. It's sort of because there's so much new technology that it's harder to identify what should we call out, what should we question, where are the claims that we should say, hang on a minute, that's not quite right. But I think we'll get there. I think we'll get there eventually.
Yeah, we will.
And the cars are a lot more. I mean, what's really going to accelerate adoption is probably vehicle choice as well. And at the moment, the range of vehicles that are now available is way better, but there's still very limited options for some user groups. I mean, if you want an electric estate car, you've basically got the extremes of a Taycan Sport Turismo, which my wife said isn't an estate car. She doesn't like estate cars, and she said it's not an estate car. So I can have it. That's good because she doesn't like estate cars.
Interesting.
And MG5, whatever, right?
Yeah, that's it.
Pretty much. But similarly, if you need a wheelchair accessible vehicle, you're pretty stuffed at the moment. So there's lots of different vehicle derivatives that we've got to get sorted in terms of electric alternatives. But the range is a lot better. The choice is a lot better now, and the used market's pretty buoyant now. I was actually quite not pleased is the wrong word, because that sounds like I'm like happy that people have got cars worth less than they thought they were. But I was. It was good news, I think, to see that actually used values were softening a bit recently, because. I was looking at eNero. I had a company eNero from 2019 to 2021, and in 2019 we bought them for about 33 grand with a bit of a discount.
Yeah, and
by 2021 you couldn't buy one for less than 33 grand. I'm like, that is not sensible market practice.
No.
Like that is not a good market condition, that they're just not depreciating at all. In 2 years, and it's not good for used buyers because they can't get their hands on them, and we all know it was due to reduced supply, and obviously supply then increased quite a lot across various brands, and therefore values softened. And I think generally that's a good thing. I think people should have had a bit more awareness that was going to happen. So people going, oh, I'm really shocked my car was worth 15 grand 6 months ago, now it's worth 10. Well, but it wasn't really worth 15 grand 6 months ago. That's the problem, is that you were told it was, but it shouldn't have been worth that because it's 4 years older. But I do think, the range of cars you can get now. We bought an MG ZS recently to swap out for a Petrolhead that we had. So we've now got two BEVs. And at that point, in that sort of vehicle segment, for the money we spent on it, it was pretty much the only thing we could have bought that was sort of big enough for like a buggy going in sideways and stuff. Yeah. There were a couple of other things we looked at. The boots weren't quite big enough, or they were too expensive. They were, all the e-Neros were well over 30k.
Yeah.
And we're like, we're not going to spend that. But now, if you want a car for about 25 to 28k, you can buy an I-Pace, you could buy Model 3 Tesla. There's loads. And you think, crikey, and that's literally in the space of 5 months. I reckon that's all changed. Crazy.
What do you think about the next? Because this is the situation I'm in. I'm looking at the prices and I go, well, I know what happened over the last 2 years. And I know that also this is probably another good topic, but you look at the pricing. I look at pricing of cars and go, a Tesla Model 3 at 30 grand, and it like a standard one, you go, well, they've just reduced, they keep lopping off the price on new cars, and you can order a new car. And there's so many cars for sale, and the same with E208s and other things I've been looking at. There's so many cars for sale. Like, let's just say there's like 500 E208s, and they're all 20 to 30, and you're like, but you can order a new one for 34. Like, over the next 6 months, 9 months, year, I don't know what it is. I'm waiting for the 50 grand Taycan. Like, it's gonna happen, and it's not gonna be that long because these cars are just, there's not enough consumers for them.
There's lots of supply coming through. All the big D fleets from those big registration years of sort of 2020, so end of 19, early 20, they're all coming through now. And obviously EVs still did well during COVID as well. So it's not like we've got a big gap in D fleet volumes coming through. We'll have a lot coming through D fleet in the next 12 months, 24 months. I agree. I think, to be honest, a lot of it is, you've seen loads of stories in the press about, dealers saying they're not going to accept any EVs anymore. They're not going to sell them, all this rubbish. And you're like, well, someone will.
They'll give a price.
I think, and as always, it's what a car is listed for is never what it's actually going to sell for, right? So there's always that kind of health warning that, people will always seek to get as much as they can on the listing. But actually, when you say, look, I'll give you this much, you will probably get a deal. There'll definitely be some softening in the market still. I mean, I've got a standing like eBay alert for EVs under $7,000, I think, just to see what's going on in the market, right? And it's basically Leafs and Zoes and the occasional Twizy. That's the reason I've got it set up. And there's lots there now, right? And there's like 30 kilowatt hour Leafs, there's 100 plus mile range Leafs going for $8,000 to $9,000 now. So there's, if you want to buy an EV for less than 10 grand, there are, I would say, quite a lot of options now. Not like 50 different models to choose from, but there's a reasonable range of options. Whereas before it was basically just you could buy a Leaf and that was it. I think there's some interesting stuff coming through the used market. I mean, for a lot of people, something like the kind of the cars that will do 100 every day of the week, 100 miles of range plus every day of the week, and do rapid charging. And if you stretch their legs, they might do more like 200 or 150 plus. Those kind of cars, I think, are the interesting ones coming through now, right? So the second gen sort of battery technology, because early Nissan Leafs did struggle a bit with early battery tech and preheating and stuff. So things like the sort of, I guess what I'd call the second generation Leaf, the 40 kilowatt hour Leaf, the Ionics, particularly, so the 38 kilowatt hour Ionic, the second gen high-end Ionic, not the Ionic 5, but the one before that. These are like 10 to 15 grand cars now that would easily be someone's only car, like quite happily. So that's I think the next sort of market that's probably quite ripe for people kind of getting stuck into as buyers.
And it is like if you've got a second car, if you've got two cars in your household, and you're remotely, if you've still got this like, I do 500 miles a week or a day in something else, fine. But owning a cheap-ish, and we are starting to see just cheap EVs. If you can charge at home or charge at work or whatever, your running costs for the year are just nothing in comparison to a petrol car.
Yeah. I mean, there were, I've seen some really early stuff, like early, like Mitsubishi IMEs and stuff like that selling. I mean, there's one the other day that sold for about $3,000. You think, well, actually, if you're spending $2,000 a year on fuel, you could basically charge that at home, and probably in 2 years you've just paid the car off. Like the car is basically just free. So it's becoming, as I say, what we need to tackle. I was sort of saying a while back, for the new car buyer, I think for a few years now, it's been a bit of a no-brainer to go for an EV for various reasons. BIK tax is a complete no-brainer for people. But the problem has been for used buyers, because actually, as a used buyer, you never got the grant, you didn't get any help. So actually, buying an EV and running it was always like, well, it's a lot more expensive than an ICE. Whereas now, I think that sort of algebra is changing a bit, and people are able to make the numbers stack up a bit more as a used purchase, which is good news generally. As I say, I mean, I know people are feeling the pinch on a car they've bought and they thought was worth more, but it's good news overall for the market. I would say that's happening.
Yeah, it needs to happen.
But yeah, I mean, used buyers getting it. I mean, we have got a bit of an issue of public charging pricing at the moment, but that is largely down to wholesale electricity prices being driven by gas. So, and I know this seems very tangential when we're talking about EVs and technology, but one of the big things that's going to happen, well, the government said it will try and do in the next 2 years, I think, I don't think it can get it done in a year, but the next couple of years, is some relatively easy way of basically de-linking the wholesale price of electricity from the wholesale price of gas. So what effectively happens is there's a system in place that prevents, because if you imagine how cheap renewables actually are to generate, right, in terms of pence per kilowatt of electricity at wholesale levels, if you let the sort of true cost of those go into the market at the true cost rather than some sort of agreed marginal cost for all producers, what you'd get is you'd just kill fossil fuels overnight because they're so cheap that if we could generate enough of them, the price of the fossil fuels would seem so apparently high that no one paid them, and therefore the markets would literally fall out. And you couldn't have that because you can't have a market collapse. So you have to sort of. So there are mechanisms in place to ensure that you can't flood the market basically with super cheap power, and everyone only pays a cheap price. Everyone basically pays the price of the kind of the higher marginal price that goes into the market. So what you end up with is the fact that gas is more expensive to produce ends up making electricity more expensive for all of us, even though the generators can produce it for less money. They can't sell it to us for less because they have to put it into the wholesale market and so on. So the only real way to get super cheap electricity is to generate it yourself at the moment. But that will change. Once that delinking happens, that will massively change and probably unlock the power of renewables. But it's not the public charging operators' fault that they're having to charge quite expensive price at the moment for electricity.
Yeah.
When I was, I remember paying, like 15p a kilowatt hour for rapid charging like 4 years ago.
Yeah.
now it's an average of about 60. So it's basically quadrupled, which seems horrendous, but it will come down. I'm convinced it will come down and come down quite significantly. Another thing is that one of the reasons why you can drive cheaper domestic prices, obviously, that domestic electricity providers hedge, right? They basically buy in advance in bulk, which public charging operators, even the biggest ones, aren't really operating enough scale yet to do that. So they're still buying like on the spot market, and they're still basically buying electricity in quite a rudimentary way, where they're not able to get the benefit of lower prices. And it is this big misconception anyway that businesses can usually buy stuff for less than consumers, right? Because they can retain the VAT and everything. There's this general perception out there among the public that domestic electricity must be more expensive than commercial electricity, which just isn't the case at all. So generally speaking, the cheapest electricity out there is domestic because you're using more of it. So most businesses cannot buy electricity for the same price as consumers can buy it for. So that's another issue, is that you get people piping up and saying, well, I can get 5p per kilowatt hour electricity, so this must mean that public charging company A, who's charging 50p, is making 45p profit. And you're like, no, it really isn't. Some of them, a couple of them I saw quotes for in terms of their electricity prices, and they were being quoted 95p a kilowatt hour for electricity. It's just, it's horrendous.
And presumably, like if you're setting up a big infrastructure charger, like you're asking for power on like a level that it trickling into your home does not consist of. You're like, I want a megawatt.
So the average. So if you're building homes, what you get most new homes now get 100 amp incoming supply, which is about 20 kilowatts of maximum power that you could be drawing at any one time. Most people don't do that, obviously. So if you imagine so although they're 20 kilowatts maximum, the kind of, if you like, average rating that a developer will look at or a grid company will look at for a home is they will assume that there'll be like an average load of about 2 kilowatts, sort of roughly, sometimes lower than that, sometimes more like a kilowatt or 0.8 kilowatts. So let's assume it's 2 kilowatts, which means that if you go and install a single 300 kilowatt charger, you are asking the grid for 150 homes worth of power for this one charger all the time, because you don't want it like only peak times during the day. You want it accessible 24/7. So not only will you end up paying more for the commercial energy to supply that charger, you'll also pay through the nose for the standing charges, because you're sort of paying the standing charges for 150 homes, right? So you're paying a massive amount for the sort of duos charges, for the network charges, to keep that power reserved for you all the time. So it's a big cost. It's not a cheap business. There's at some point, public charging companies might start making decent profits, and I hope they do for their sake. But at the moment, none of them are making. None of them, go and look at their accounts. None of them are making profits. Yeah. None of them are rolling around in cash. They're all investing masses of capital up front for a market that is really yet to develop at scale. And utilization rates are still very low. We're probably still looking at like between 5 and 10% average utilization across most public charge points. We're not at like saturation point anywhere near it, and anything like that. So there's a big challenge for those operators still to come.
And it must be like our power usage at home, of which I would love smart rates for the entire day, every half an hour. I would love it to change as demand changed, and then you could literally go, nah, I'm just not doing that for that 30 minute period. But charging must be the same. You set up all this infrastructure, you've got all these chargers, and then weekends when people are traveling, or early in the morning when people are doing whatever, and then in the evening when they're going back at night, and then the rest of the time, 2 a.m., nothing is happening.
Yeah. So some companies are already doing off-peak, on-peak charging. So some companies, public charging operators, are already offering a peak rate and an off-peak rate, which is quite binary, right? It's just standard sort of almost time of use. The future, I think, will be much more dynamic. I don't doubt that there'll be a future in the years to come where you will go and, where you see a totem today, the kind of that's what they call the kind of the big signs where you see the petrol prices on, right? The totems. So I'm sure there'll be totems in future that show you the price per kilowatt hour, and it will change. It might change every half an hour. Actually, it might potentially flicker up and down every half an hour, right? I'm sure there'll be that future, because that's where markets are going. We will ultimately, people will switch to half-hourly settlements, half-hourly billing. You can already get that at home if you're a customer. So you can already go to someone like, Octopus and their agile tariff, where you're basically going to pay a different price electricity every half an hour, depending on demand, and you get those 24 hours in advance. So you can basically, and the smart thing will be, at the moment, you might see those rates and you might make some manual adjustments in your home. But what we and others are trying to do is automate a lot of that, so that, whether it's your heating or your EV, is to take tariff information like that and go, right, so we know 24 hours in advance what the tariffs are. We will plug those into our algorithms, work out what you as a customer want to do based on previous behavior on a Thursday, and we'll charge your hot water tank or your home battery or your car at various times based on the cheapness of those electricity rates every half an hour, based on when it's cheapest to do so, to get the job done for you. And you won't have to manually intervene. That's the kind of dream scenario, is where consumers can just kind of live, and actually all this stuff gets sort of reconciled in the background through smart tech and algorithms. Basically, that's the obviously with manual intervention if you want to do that, but most people in our view are not going to want to do that long term. They'll just want the technology to kind of just work in the background for them. That's where it should go. That's
absolutely where I wanted to be. Like at the moment, because I have an off peak and a peak rate, and I charge the EV during the off peak. I can't do the smart thing where it works it out because of charger and car and whatever. But I generally now, at the end of the day, just because it takes no more effort, and I'm like, well, I might as well do it. If I'm going to put the dishwasher on, I'll plus 3 hours or plus 6 hours or whatever. Yeah. So I know it's going to be in the window. Now, I am very ready for the button that's just like, I don't know, auto hour or whatever.
Yeah. Auto cheapness.
Cheapness.
Low cost dishwasher.
And it's just going to be done by 8 a.m. or 7 a.m. or whatever. I think it's a good way to sort of segue into some of the MyEnergy stuff. So what does MyEnergy specialize in? And then also, can you run through some of the sort of consumer side of stuff?
Yeah, sure. So MyEnergy is, so it's only about a 6-year-old company now, 6.5 years old now. So it started off, so it's founded by 2 people, so Jordan and Lee. So Jordan is our kind of marketing genius and Lee is our engineering genius. And I'd say on that front, actually, it's important that, having worked for lots of automotive startups and stuff before, is that you often find companies with engineering geniuses behind them with no idea how to market themselves, and you end up with products that go on the great waste dump of good ideas because no one knew how to market them. And I think that's that's almost been our secret sauce, is we've had the great products and the great ability to market them. So we're really about making people more energy independent. Now, we're not saying everyone should go off grid, because actually everyone being off grid is a bad thing. We don't want everyone to be off grid. It's good for people to remain connected to the energy system for reasons we can chat in a minute. But we are about making sure people can be more energy independent and take more control over their own energy usage and generation if they can generate themselves. So our first product was actually a solar diverter. So it basically recognizes when you have surplus solar being generated, and it sends it somewhere useful in the home as what we call a resistive load, something like a hot water tank, a heater, an underfloor heating system, for example. So you could be out of work, and this system will just know that you've got solar panels, you've got some solar being generated. Rather than sending it back to the grid for a few pence, which is not really worth it these days, it will actually use that somewhere useful in the home. And it will basically displace gas. That's the key thing, right? Is that in most homes that have a gas boiler, it stops you from your gas boiler turning on to heat your home up later, because it's already been heated through the solar during the day. That was good at reducing some of that solar waste and actually making solar more useful. But to then sort of maximize the solar even more, the next product in the range was the Zappi, so our EV charger, which was the first sort of charger in the world to charge exclusively from solar. So a lot of chargers do something called solar matching, where they basically kind of work out what rate you want to charge at, so 7 kilowatts. And if there's 2 kilowatts of solar, they'll top you up with 5 from the grid.
Yeah.
Now, that's good because you're getting 2 kilowatts of solar, so I'm not saying it's a bad thing. But what we can do is we can charge only from solar. So currently, if I look at my app, so my car is habitually plugged in a mode called Eco Plus. So at the moment, I won't show you on here because I'm not sure the camera will pick it up, but I'm getting 3.6 kilowatts of solar, and 3.3 of that is going into my car with no. Nice. So I'm not using grid electricity at all at the moment. The house is using 300 watts, so that's probably this microphone, the laptop, everything else, right? But basically, that's the idea: is that we're smartly using that solar energy that would otherwise be going back to the grid, and not being useful for anyone really, and we're using it for good for the consumer and reducing their bills. So the holy grail, if you like, is for us to develop products that allow customers to get to 100% self-consumption, where every drop of solar you're generating on your roof, you're using. Now, as I say, it's a holy grail in the sense that it's probably not quite achievable, but we want people to get as close as possible to that number, basically, because anything you send back to the grid isn't really worth it anymore, as I say, so it's better to kind of consume it yourself if you can. It doesn't mean that you won't use grid. You might still use grid, but it's basically saying that you're using all the solar at least. So it might be that solar accounts for 70% of your electricity in the year or 60% or whatever, but you're using all of it, basically. One of the challenges with the kind of ecosystem we've set up so far with sort of the solar diverter, the EV charger, etc., was that people were still generating energy at points where maybe they weren't there, so they didn't have their car plugged in because the car was at work, and they were still generating excess. That the hot water tank was heated, and they were still generating more. So there's big demand for batteries at home. So the idea of electric vehicle being a storage battery is fine if the car is there. If the car's not there, then it's not plugged in, and therefore it can't act as a battery for the house. So home batteries are obviously massive now. They're growing in the UK, they're growing in Germany, etc. Where we've also got a subsidiary. So we've also got a home battery product called Libby, which we can sort of plumb into that ecosystem. So whenever your micro generation is generating, the idea is it could be sending that power somewhere, either to be used now for charging an EV or heating hot water, or for use later if you're putting it in a battery for use in peak times rather than relying on the grid. And you can also do things like charge that battery off cheap electricity, like you can charge your car. So the idea is you can use it for sort of energy arbitrage, basically, and sort of soak up cheap electricity and use it in peak times. Obviously, our technology works if you don't have solar as well. So plenty of people have a Zappi charger because it's a smart charger. Not they don't necessarily need to use solar functionality if they can't have solar. People are already ordering the Libby battery from us to do, as I say, energy arbitrage. So they're saying, well, actually, I've worked out that, say, on Octopus Go, I can soak up 20 kilowatt hours a night of cheap energy, and that's more than my daily requirement. So actually, I'm going to order a 10, 15, 20 kilowatt hour battery from you guys and basically use that as like a way of basically long-term reducing my energy bills, because I'm always going to charge off peak, charge that battery off peak. So you don't have to have solar to do it, but we do see this tremendous growth in home solar, which really helps reduce people's bills, but also give them, as I say, more energy independence. Because I think what the horrific war in Ukraine has done for a lot of people, and this is silver lining is a horrible term to use in that context, but it's woken people up to the idea that energy is very volatile. Whereas I think energy prices had been a sort of asleep for a while. I think where people probably hadn't been paying much notice to their bills. They'd been coming in. They'd been annoyed about paying an energy bill, but it hadn't really been a big issue for them. And suddenly, energy prices basically doubled or tripled for a lot of people in a very short space of time. And people were kind of saying, well, why is this happening? And trying to understand the whole energy system as a result, and realizing that it's, some of it's built on some pretty fragile foundations. So as I say, it's been this huge drive to push people get their own energy generation at home. So domestic solar sales, more than doubled last year, almost tripled, and they'll do the same this year, we think. People are also investing in community renewables. So there's companies like Ripple that do community-owned wind farms. There's community-owned solar farms. So people are also investing in local generation that will do the same thing, but not necessarily on their own roof, really. So it's a big market.
How does that one work? Because I've heard about Ripple, and you can invest in a local solar farm or whatever, and you get cheap rates because of it. But how does that actually work? Like, how do you get cheap rates?
So ultimately, it's about, they effectively end up being a generator, right? So you're not directly connected to that wind farm. You have an energy supplier. So for example, you might buy into Ripple. You might be an Octopus Energy customer. So Octopus Energy is effectively on your meter. They are your supplier. But what you're doing by the ownership is basically those kind of credits for the generation side are coming to you and offsetting your bill. So you can get to the point where you're effectively you're taking the lump of energy that's being generated by the wind turbine into your bill instead in that sense, and sort of offsetting that way. So it doesn't work with every energy supply. You've got to look at the energy suppliers these companies work with, but that's the kind of model. And I mean, the energy market is ripe. It is being shaken up, and it is ripe for shake up because it's this big kind of sleepy giant that's been resting on its laurels for far too long. I think in terms of it's a very in most cases it's a highly uninnovative market, right? Yeah. Where companies bluntly like Octopus and so on are shaking it up and are doing things differently. But it's if you think about, someone said to me the other day, if you think about the energy market and say, imagine energy supplies didn't exist, right? Imagine energy was like potatoes, and someone said, right, you want potatoes. What are your options for getting potatoes? Your options are grow them. So you can go into your back garden and grow them if you want. That might be a cheap way to do it, but only works if you've got a garden. So similar sort of analogy to solar, right? That you can generate your own energy, but only if you have the means to do it. Or you can go to a shop and buy them, I guess. But again, let's maybe not think about that. But if your neighbour's growing potatoes, why don't you buy their potatoes? Because actually they're cheaper than the ones from the shop probably. So if your neighbour's generating surplus solar, could you not buy it from them? Yeah. So are there future models where, so right now I'm exporting, so I'm not exporting anything at the moment, but if I was exporting, could I have a setup in future where my exports automatically went to like my neighbour? Not as a direct connection, but basically through sort of digital energy infrastructure, digital energy data infrastructure. Could those effectively be exports? Be almost, if I say I want them to go to my neighbour, and they pay me for those so they pay more than my solar export rate, which is like 4 or 5p or whatever, 10p. So they might pay me 20p per kilowatt hour, which is saving them 20p a kilowatt hour on what they pay their energy supply. So there's loads of ways we can make energy much more innovative and think about localization of energy much more. But as I say, at the moment, it's a bit of an oligopoly, the energy market, and it's I think it's what electric vehicles and heat pumps and electrification is doing generally is it's shaking it up because there's going to be such a dramatic change in the way that energy is produced, consumed, and moved about that the market is having to innovate to kind of keep up, I guess.
Yeah, and it's really interesting how all those sort of options for tying in with the EVs, or taking it right back to the beginning of our conversation, you could have a charger on. If you've got a driveway that's empty, you're out all the day or whatever, someone could come in, charge their car, but they could charge it from the solar. You can charge them 25, 30p a kilowatt hour, whatever the hell you want to charge. And you basically you're getting it for free ish. You're not going to use it, and it's only worth 5p to you or something. So you're earning money out of it. And then
Yeah.
do any of the big, I presume I've learned a little bit about the grid over the last year or so, and the more I learn about it, the more I really want to meet someone who's like works on it, because it sounds incredibly complicated. But if you've got your fast chargers, someone set up some fast chargers, and if you put a solar farm next to it, you can't just go, unless 1 equals 1 in terms of what you need and what you use and what you produce, supply is exactly the same. You do have to do something with it. So your solar farm has to be connected to the grid, and they have to say,
has to be in balance. That's right.
they have to say that's fine, and then you'll have to get your chargers, and then you then go, that's fine. So you can't just put in a bunch of solar for the 30 minutes that you're going to need it, because you're generating electricity all the time, and it gets complicated, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. So there has to be you have to basically balance supply and demand all the time. I mean, the most dramatic example of that, I guess, in a way, is that at the moment we pay a massive amount to turn off renewable generation every year.
Yeah.
Which, aiming for net zero, seems bizarre, right? That we would pay to turn off wind turbines and shut down solar farms. So it's ridiculous that we do it, but we have to do it to balance the grid, because you can't have more energy coming into the pipes and wires, as it were, than is being taken out of the pipes and wires. So rather than doing that, that's where the idea of kind of flexibility comes in. So this is why I think there was a report last month from Ofgem saying they think that basically electrification of vehicles, heat pumps, all that sort of stuff, and batteries at home, I think their estimate was it could save the grid about £4.7 billion a year by the end of the decade. Now, we would agree with that. I mean, we haven't done the maths to that figure, but we would agree with that principle, which is that by basically you're creating a distributed energy infrastructure. That's the key. Rather than at the moment we have a very centralized energy infrastructure with big peaky power plants we have to turn off and on stuff. You get this distributed network where you can basically level stuff out more, and you can kind of flatten the curves, flatten the peaks and flatten the troughs out, I guess. That's the idea. So that actually you can modulate the grid much better. And as I say, even with the number of home chargers that are out there today, if all of those home chargers were available for flexibility services, if they were all kind of on the grid, available on demand at the grid's requirement, let's imagine those were all charging at the same time. If you suddenly had a requirement for a whole bunch more power, if you basically could just pause those for an hour, which probably wouldn't affect anyone in the most of the people would not get affected by that, because most people are charging overnight and wouldn't even notice it. That would be that amount of power. If you could actually pause them all, which you can do, as in technically you can do, but if they're all connected and consented in, that would equal more power than any single one of the UK's current nuclear reactors, right? So if your options are pull a lever and turn on a nuclear power station, or turn off a load of EV chargers, well, actually, at the moment it's turn on a coal power plant, which is even worse, right? Or turn off a load of EV chargers. Let's turn off the EV chargers, because incentivizing, you probably won't have to incentivize people massively to do that, because the inconvenience factor is so low. Actually, long term, consumers may not even need specific incentives to do that. They might need an incentive to opt into the program, as it were, the system, but they may not need specific incentives for every single tiny event you run. But you don't have to turn on a dirty coal power plant, and you certainly have to pay to turn it on, which is even more worrisome, right? So actually, that's why it's going to save money and save energy in the long term, because you're basically just using the grid sensibly to balance it out, rather than having to invest in new power generation.
Yeah.
So all this stuff about people saying, "Oh, we're going to need 20 new nuclear power stations to power," it's all total garbage. It's all total rubbish.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the figures I love the most is that, in terms of energy saving, I guess not so much flexibility, is that we, since 2005, so between 2005 and 2020, in that 15-year period, we reduced annual electricity consumption in the UK by 77 gigawatt hours, right? So that's 77 million kilowatt hours, I think. I'm trying to work that out. So 77 gigawatt hours, right? Hang on. No, I'm completely wrong. 77 terawatt hours, so billion kilowatt hours. That's better. So we reduced it by 77 terawatt hours per year of electricity, and that was almost not solely, but majority of that was driven by LED light bulbs because we did a big switch to LED light bulbs, which are massively more efficient. Right? And again, really easy, no consumer. I mean, the initial investment, fine, but does anyone notice they've got LEDs now over halogens? No, most people think they're nicer. So because we did that, we reduced that amount of energy per year. And if you fast forward to 2050 and look at the Climate Change Committee's projection on what we will need to power all of the electric vehicles in the UK, the kind of midpoint of the estimates is about 75 to 80 terawatt hours per year. So everyone says, oh my God, Tom, we'll need so much electricity to power all these EVs. I go, well, yeah, it's a lot, but it's about the same amount that we've already reduced consumption by in the last 15 years. And if you think about all the sectors that are growing, EVs are not the sector that's going to need the most electricity growth from now until 2050. Yeah. It's going to be stuff like industry. It's going to be stuff like electrifying steel making and stuff like that. That's where the big challenge is going to come from.
Yeah, and you look at sort of electricity consumption, people look at it as like just a number. But it's not. It's that time curve that we're talking about, and you just have to have the capacity in the grid to be able to match that peak. So if you're charging at any time less than peak, it doesn't matter. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, it literally, if you're using more electricity at any time less than that peak part of the day, you've got the capacity.
Yeah.
So there's plenty. If you look at it as like a sort of sunrise curve, which fits quite well with various stuff. Outside of that, there's plenty of space for more capacity. And the idea, like you said, of plugging stuff in, it can work one way where you can turn off your chargers and they don't charge. But actually what we'll probably have is it can work the other way. You can pull power out of the chargers. You can pull power out of your car and you'll get paid for it. Or if there's oversupply, there's a crazy amount of wind and no one's using it, you can dump it into the car. And the price for electricity goes negative, you get paid.
Yeah. Or even better, you end up with, or you end up doing effectively, you do like battery to grid using home batteries, right, rather than the car. Because actually, again, you've got the issue of the car is only a useful battery if it's plugged in. So you've got to have that reliance. And actually, some people might have theirs plugged in quite habitually for things like solar generation. But actually, if you don't, then your car is a sort of a stranded asset on the driveway, as it were. But the home battery is there, right? Is there to be to help. But yeah, I mean, people massively underestimate, I think, that importance of having that distributed network of energy infrastructure. And as long as it can all communicate and talk to each other, it won't be this threat, that people think it will be. But it's and all the other options on the table are far more energy intensive anyway. So again, if you're interested in, someone's interested in energy kind of consumption, energy draw, or concerned about it, if you want to go down the route of hydrogen for anything, for heating, for cars, for anything, if you want to go down the road of synthetic fuels, then you're going to need maybe 4 or 5 times the amount of electricity to produce those things in the equivalent quantity. So electric vehicles at least are, appear to be the best case from an efficiency point of view as well, because we can't, although renewable power is renewable, it's not sufficiently abundant to just add more of it. It literally doesn't. Well, it grows trees. It doesn't grow on trees, but it doesn't basically become available at the flick of a switch. So actually, we should still care about energy efficiency. So someone said to me, it does. The fact that hydrogen cars need 4 or 5 times as much electricity per mile to run them doesn't matter because renewables can deliver all of that. And you think, well, no, but then we're saying we're going to invest 5 times more renewables than we really might need. Why would we do that? What's the virtue of doing that? So we need to build the system in the right way, in the right size. And one of the things that distribution networks talk about a lot is the right sizing of the network. They don't want to, and you always hear this term from a distribution network, is they don't want to overinvest in the pipes and wires, right? They don't want to overinvest in the pipes and wires in their area. So rather than putting massive new cabling in, they would rather you all opted into flexibility services for your devices. That's what they would rather happen. And I guess in some ways that's good and the right thing to do. But there's got to be a balance between, there needs to be the investment in the pipes and wires, But we also need to incentivize consumers to participate in the grid as well. And I think a lot of people will do that because it would just make sense, bluntly.
Yeah, it's as a sort of techie person, I love the concept of generating my own power and then having it like get managed really well, going into the car, doing all the stuff, whatever. And I'm still going to have a sports car. I'm still going to create loud noises, but that's most of the time I probably won't be.
And it's going back to that pie chart, right? It's what fraction of the pie chart of road transport emissions comes from classic cars, comes from people taking the car down to Goodwood on a Saturday.
Yeah.
Fraction. And actually, the solutions to that may appear, that if we're gonna go down the road of things like synthetic fuels, let's do it for converting, I don't know, E-types or F40s to run on that rather than unleaded. Maybe, I don't know, but I don't. If we want, we're talking about net zero still at the moment. We're not talking about absolute zero. So, it may be possible, and I expect it will be possible for quite some time to carry on driving internal combustion engines, but only if you decarbonise all the boring stuff first. And that's sort of always what I've advocated. Is basically if you're a passionate car enthusiast, you should actually proactively want to decarbonise and electrify all of the 2-litre diesel boring boxes out there, so you can carry on driving your Myenergi Coupe, in my case, whatever. You want to. I don't own one, by the way, but I want to own. But you can carry on driving the nice car because actually you've got enough in the carbon budget to do that. But at the moment, we won't have enough in the carbon budget to do that unless we decarbonise all the boring run-of-the-mill stuff first. Basically, that's the kind of argument I've always used from if you want to call it a petrol analogy. It's basically, would you rather the last drop of petrol was used for someone driving to work or someone driving around the track at Goodwood? I don't know.
Yeah. There are so many topics to cover in this large space. So I'm going to sort of dial back and hit a slight pause on cruising more in. I've got some I do 5 questions at the end of every podcast, and we'll do them. But I've got a funny one that I came across the other day, and it was a story, a headline from some rubbish newspaper or whatever, and it's like, our car parks are going to get crushed by the weight of all these EVs. That makes me laugh, that one.
Yeah, I saw that one too. And actually, I think the key thing was that they hadn't even looked at the spec. There's basically a building spec for the weight per square meter of car parks that they weren't even considering, which is already sufficient for an electric car. And I think the weird basis of their argument appeared to be that electric cars are heavier than a 1960s Ford Cortina.
Yes.
Ignoring the fact that any internal combustion engine car is also heavier than a 1960s Ford Cortina and have coped perfectly well. So, yeah, I love the fact that we've managed to switch to lots of people having 2-ton SUVs, and no one ever questioned them driving around car parks. And yet suddenly, because they're electric, so there's suddenly a concern about electric vehicles. Bluntly, it's a garbage story. I mean, it's a garbage story, and it's hyperbole. And actually, the quote from the guy who did the report even sort of said, "Well, I don't even know if this is a problem, but we should certainly be thinking about it." And I'm a bit worried. There are some legitimate things we need to think about with EVs and things like car parts and boring stuff. There's some fire brigade precautions that mean you can't put them too far down in a really underground car park. But all those stuff can be solved, right? There's a lot of junk stories out there.
There are, yeah. And actually, there's. I'm just going to avoid going now because I think I've probably got about another 4 hours worth of topics to discuss on EVs and whatever. So 5 questions. Do you have a most memorable driving trip or journey?
To be fair, my most memorable driving trip was actually in an RV in New Zealand with my wife. We drove around North and South Islands in a big RV. So the vehicle wasn't particularly special, but the experience of driving around was very good. And actually, a great example of something that probably could have been electric, because actually, if there was electric at all the campsites we went to, which of course there was for hookups, if there's enough electric to charge, we could have had an electric RV and done that trip just as well.
That would be I would love something. I don't know whether it exists yet, like a little van or ID Buzz type vehicle as my podcast studio that I can
that's
drive
cool.
somewhere,
Do a
and
podcast
do a
on
podcast
location.
on location, but in a setup. And the EV-ness, you've got all the plugs, you've got all the stuff, you've got all the power demands. Like, no problem. I would really love that.
Just so I hope a manufacturer is listening to this podcast and thinks that would be a cool PR thing to do.
Yes,
there's been various
exactly.
like one-offs created for various press releases, like a one-off barbecue thing or a one-off DJ booth or something. Maybe a podcast studio is the
I
one.
think an ID Buzz, but like maybe the next gen. I wanted to go a little bit further. But for my presumably podcast gear, that's not going to use cameras and whatnot. That's tiny amounts of power.
Yeah, hundreds of watts.
Yeah. No, I think your journey in that camper van, it kind of sums up that question. I think for a lot of people, really, it's never really about the car. Like it can be about the car, but it's always about where you are, who you're with, what you're doing, what you're seeing.
Like nobody's ever had a memorable journey in a really nice car driving through like Pimlico, I suspect, or something. Like it's just location matters as
they
well.
Get robbed.
Yeah. I mean, like in an ICE, I had a very nice week with a Myenergi coupe. Didn't do anything necessarily. Nice. I mean, yeah, like ping David to Morven and stuff in it. Did Brecon Beacons in my old Audi TT. That was fun. Like that was a nice. Again, it's the experience, right? It's actually combined experience. It's not just the set wheels.
Yeah. If you could only drive, I don't know how to frame this one, because I know. I'll give you the question how I say it to everyone else. If you're going to drive one car for the rest of your life, and you're allowed like I'm going to add inflation, £600, £700 sort of banger on the side, what would it be?
I mean, I'm going to cop out and say, in a way, I do love the I-Pace, and I'd be happy to carry on with it. I think the Taycan's too tempting though. I think I'd go for a Taycan Sport Turismo, and I'd have to convince my wife that the boot was big enough for those one trip a year things you mentioned earlier.
You could get I know I've got a friend who's got a Taycan. He's got two.
Nice sleek roof box for holidays.
He's got a roof box.
Yeah.
That's another car. That's another one I look at. I love the car. I'm like, yeah, but what's like? We know that the tech's going to change so soon, and these things are evolving so much that unless it's like, if they're 40, 50 grand, which who knows, at the end of the year they might be, I think I'll have a Taycan.
I think if you're going to buy used, maybe wait a bit. I think we've made that step up to sort of 800 volt architecture and 250, 300 kilowatt charge. I don't think we're going to see any cars doing like megawatt charging. I don't think we're going to see a massive step change in battery tech or charging speeds from that level of car. I think if you were buying sort of what I would call a first gen sort of 400 volt EV product, then maybe look at the newer stuff. But I think we've probably made the step that's going to be the step till 2030 or beyond now. Yeah,
but we do see, if you look at most manufacturers, and I don't know how this will ramp, we're getting sort of 5 to 10% ish range increases each year.
Although again, on paper, is it real? I don't know.
On paper, yeah, exactly. Are you measuring it differently?
There's a lot of jiggery pokery on the WLTP. I think that's the. I've seen a lot of people who bluntly end up buying cars. As I say, my rule of thumb thing stays the same of like 3 to 4 miles per kilowatt hour, 3 to 4 miles per usable kilowatt hour of the battery pack. So make sure that you know what the usable kilowatt hours of your pack are. In some cases, like the Kias, it's the size they state is the usable pack. So 64 kilowatt hours is 64 kilowatt hours. The battery is actually a bit bigger, but they don't tell you that, which is, I think, the best way to do it is tell the consumer the usable bit. I think, use that metric, and probably all EVs are about the same at the moment. I think a lot of the manufacturer claims about, there was an EV the other day, I won't say the manufacturer again, but if you worked it out, it was over 6 miles per kilowatt hour on, to get the range they stated. No one's doing regularly, apart from people absolutely hypermiling it. No one is getting 6 miles per hour as an average figure. It's just not happening.
That's it. And I see various cars come out and people say, oh, they're, that one's really efficient. And then they say something like, oh yeah, it's going to get 5 to 6.
Yeah.
And you go,
the only EV I've ever driven that would be a reliable 6 miles per kilowatt hour or more, actually more like 9, is a Renault Twizy. Which I would happily have,
fair enough.
I've nearly bought one many times. I really will buy one day. My
What do you
wife's like,
think?
you
Yeah. What do you
of a
think is
Twizy.
the most undervalued car at the moment? Is it a Twizy?
I think I seriously I think the Twizy is well ahead of its time.
Yeah.
I've driven the Ami. I really like the Ami as a concept. There's loads of cool stuff about it that I think is really
Yeah.
is properly properly forward looking in a general sense about manufacturing and usage and in life usage and stuff. Where the body panels are the same and all this sort of stuff. So the front and the back are the same. The doors. There's really clever stuff like that. I just wish it could go a bit faster, and I don't mean from a speed point of view. That the 30-mile-an-hour limiter is because it's like a I can't remember what it is. It's a 7 or 8 horsepower car versus about 18 in the Twizy, and that is the difference. Like I know it sounds stupid in the world of 600 horsepower EVs, but that little 10 horsepower difference
means a lot.
It means a lot in a car that size, and it's I commuted from Kent to London quite happily for a week in a Twizy years ago. And I was doing the A20 at 50 miles an hour, 55 miles an hour. It's fine. Like genuinely, wasn't a problem. You couldn't do that on an Ami. So an Ami would be a very short leash car. If you were literally driving around London all day, it would be fine. It would be great. And as I say, the interior is a bit more usable than a Twizy. But I would have a Twizy over an Ami because it can go that bit faster and it can do 50 mile an hour. I think if you had something in that segment of ultra light, no frills, 50 mile an hour capable, 40 miles on a charge, 30 miles on a charge. That's the really interesting proposition for urban mobility. I actually think one of the most undervalued cars out there as an EV proposition for kind of a daily is probably the old iMEV, Mitsubishi iMEV, Citroen C0, Peugeot Ion triplet, which are all the same. The difference as a nerd is that the iMEV has a few different driving modes you can exploit, whereas the others have this weird little gearbox cover that stops you getting into those modes.
What's it called?
So the Mitsubishi iMEV, so IMEIEV, and then Citroen and Peugeot had the same vehicle underneath. They rebodied it, so they rebadged it. One was called C0 and one was called the Ion, which I think should have been called the Lion, as in lithium ion. Never mind. They're not pretty cars, I think it's fair to say, but they will do they've got about a 16 kilowatt battery pack, very efficient. They'll happily do, at launch, they were doing sort of 70, 80 miles of range. They'd probably do 50, 60, 50 odd miles of range now, but you can pick one of those up for $4,000 and it has DC charging. So you get DC CHAdeMO rapid charging on it. So it's actually, you could do, I could nip up to Luton from where I live, charge in 20 minutes and come home again. Like that's an interesting little car that most people probably wouldn't buy on its looks, but actually from a financial point of view, for literally a few grand is probably the most underrated EV on the market, in the used market anyway.
Yeah, okay. What's the most interesting car to you at the moment?
Really good question. Can I say one that hasn't been launched yet?
Yeah.
Citroen Ollie.
The concept thing.
The Ollie, yeah. That's really interesting to me. Again, I like it's basically taking it's taking the kind of like whole life thinking behind the Ami and like upsizing it to a bigger vehicle. I really like manufacturers that are thinking about the way that cars are manufactured and designed, not just the performance. That's interesting to me. As I say, I'm not going back to the whole, I'm not a Petrolhead thing. I'm more about motor industry and the product. I think that's really interesting.
It is the lengths they've gone to in that to make, it's got this stupid vertical windscreen, but like it's way easier to make. It's way less glass, less weight, whatever, blah, 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 blah. Like with the Ami where it was like, it's the same front as the back. Like you're just making one part and
just thoughtful. Thoughtful design and manufacturing, I think, is important now because we can't just focus on how the car is being propelled. We've got to think about life cycle. I mean, people like Polestar are also doing amazing work in this space, just really honest, transparent work on life cycle analysis, which I think is really valuable. And again, I wish more people would do it. I think Polestar's sort of worth a mention there in terms of what they're focusing on from a cradle to grave approach as well.
Yeah, it's interesting to see more of these things, and it's it's refreshing to see nice design solutions where you go, okay, they've done something clever there. It's not just the same box with the same stuff. They've moved it around.
It's like, what is the most, I don't know, it's kind of almost saying, like the Isogonus Mini, like the TCV, like what is where's the last icon in that sense of like,
yeah.
And by icon, I mean in terms of really thinking about the need behind the vehicle and designing it for need rather than just design's sake, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I can't really think of one recently.
Things that pop into my head are, I feel like someone talked about this and therefore I remember it. Things like the i3 were very interesting when they came out. Some of the Dacias, the like Duster and stuff like that.
Yeah.
The way they've approached the design is very much like, we're here to make a cheap car. What do we need? What do we not
Unashamedly,
need?
yeah.
And like, let's just kind of make it fun.
That's a good point.
But looking at it from I don't know, as you go up, I think things like the Gordon Murray, I don't know about the T50, but let's just say something like that. It's a road car. They're designing a road car. It's not necessarily done anything different, so it's not super edgy, but most manufacturers are not designing a road car anymore. They're in that space. They're designing some sort of track monster thing.
Yeah.
And
basically, has the car
road.
been designed by the marketing department or not? Is, I guess, the my slightly cynical question is like,
have they gone, what can we sell? What do we think we can sell? What are people interested in? Numbers, right? What are the biggest numbers? So therefore we can add the biggest price. That sort of thing.
And it's a bit like, it's the old, I can't remember, was it an Ogilvy quote? David, I can't remember who said it, but it's the whole thing about consumers don't actually know what they want, right? Everyone says, the customer's always right. We'll design to what customers are asking for. Actually, a lot of the time that's rubbish. People don't know what they want. And it's that, and I think the i3 is a good shout. It's sort of like, let's bring something to market which people aren't screaming for, but I think we can educate them about why they need it and why they want it, whatever. I think I'm interested in whoever's doing the next one of those things, basically.
That ethos, the i3 ethos, but to a car now of a similar sort of size. If BMW relaunched the i3 but version 2, like now, I think it would be awesome.
Yeah, like, i3, and I reckon i3 almost e-Nero sized, like X1 sized or something, but basically I'd need a little bit of bigger boot and I need doors that open in a kid-friendly way, because my issue is like car park. You've gone into a bay in a car park, you've got this much space between you and the next car. Sorry, that much space. You open the front door, then you have to open the rear door. How do you get a child? You can't get. So I was like, I can't understand how you make that work. And I know people, I know friends who have had them with kids, and like, oh, they're fine. It works easily. I'm like, I don't understand how. I just don't understand the physics of it.
I'd love one. Is like sliding doors. If you're in that situation, you need sliding doors, and then you have
Peugeot 1007 or whatever it was.
Or like a Ventador or something.
Twizzy doors, there you go.
Twizzy doors, exactly.
Yeah.
Right. Final question. 5-car garage, unlimited budget. Got to fit into your life-ish, whatever. Off you go.
Unlimited budget even. Okay. McLaren F1. GTR. Morgan Aero Coupe.
Nice.
Twizy. Actually, Twizy F1. I'd have an Oakley designed Twizy F1 edition. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
One of those 5. They're nice. Taycan Sport Turismo.
Yeah. Which one?
Taycan Sport Turismo, not the Cross Turismo.
But which?
I think I'd go for like a 4S, maybe.
Yeah, I think so.
Or maybe a GTS. I wouldn't go insane turbo S. I don't think I'd need it. I'd go 4S, I reckon.
A classic?
Maybe,
You've sort of got modern.
I just don't know. I don't want to be boring and say like an E-Type.
Right, what's your daily in this situation? I can't.
Well, Taycan. The Taycan's a daily.
Taycan. Yeah.
Do you know what? I'm not. Look, I've got a McLaren F1 GTR in there and an Aero Coupe, so I'm not an EV absolutist. But do you know what? Actually, I think I'd have to get an original Tesla Roadster. Because I drove one of those really early on, and actually they're mega money now, annoyingly, but I know someone who bought one for about 50 grand. Who I reckon he could sell it for 4 times as much now if he wanted to.
Wow. Yeah.
So that's not a classic, but it's a bit of a.
It's
also
in the
like
EV world. It is,
and it was a car that Elon Musk made before he became too weird as well. Which I quite like. So yeah, I don't know. There's a bit of Lotus in there as well, I guess, in a way, in terms of their help. But yeah, so so what's that? 3 EVs and 2 ICEs. That's not too bad.
That's all right. Cool. Well, thanks very much for coming on the podcast. I hope the listeners got some juicy info on that. I think we had. There's so many topics to go down and discuss in this space. And dive into and what
lots of rabbit holes and lots of arguments, debates and stuff as well, which is kind of what I like, because there's no a lot of the I'm not an absolutist, as I say, and there's a lot of nuance people don't often explore.
Exactly.
So, and to explore nuance, you have to have time, and stuff like 140 characters or 280 characters on Twitter is not a good way to explore nuance. Which I often fail to do. Yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks very much.
No problem. Thanks, Sam.